This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 33. "No man," says a rabbi by way of indisputable instance, "may turn the bones of his father and mother into spoons," sure that his hearers felt the checks against that form of economy. The market for spoons has never expanded enough for any one to say, "Why not?" and to argue that human progress lies in such an application of material. The only check to be alleged is a sentiment, which will coerce none who do not hold that sentiments are the better part of the world's wealth. Deronda meanwhile took to a less fashionable form of exercise than riding in Rotten Row. He went often rambling in those parts of London which are most inhabited by common Jews. He walked to the synagogues at times of service, he looked into shops, he observed faces—a process not very promising of particular discovery. Why did he not address himself to an influential rabbi or other member of a Jewish community, to consult on the chances of finding a mother named Cohen, with a son named Ezra and a lost daughter named Mirah? He thought of doing so after Christmas. The fact was, notwithstanding all his sense of poetry and common things, Deronda, where a keen personal interest was aroused, could not, more than the rest of us, continuously escape suffering from the pressure of that hard, unaccommodating actual, which has never consulted our taste and is entirely unselect. Enthusiasm, we know, dwells at ease among ideas, tolerates garlic breathed in the Middle Ages, and sees no shabbiness in the official trappings of classic processions. It gets squeamish when ideals press upon it as something warmly incarnate, and can hardly face them without fainting. Lying dreamily in a boat, imagining one's self in quest of a beautiful maiden's relatives in Cordova, elbowed by Jews in the time of Ibn Gabirol, all the physical incidents can be borne without shock. Or if the scenery of St. Mary Axe and Whitechapel were imaginatively transported to the borders of the Rhine at the end of the 11th century, when in the ears listening for the signals of the Messiah, the hep, hep, hep of the Crusaders came like the bay of bloodhounds, and in the presence of those devilish missionaries with sword and firebrand the crouching figure of the reviled Jew turned round erect, heroic, flashing with sublime constancy in the face of torture and death, what would the dingy shops and unbeautiful faces signify to the thrill of contemplative emotion? But the fervor of sympathy with which we contemplate a grandiose martyrdom is feeble compared with the enthusiasm that keeps unslacked where there is no danger, no challenge, nothing but impartial midday falling on commonplace, perhaps half repulsive objects, which are really the beloved ideas made flesh. Here undoubtedly lies the chief poetic energy, in the force of imagination that pierces or exalts the solid fact instead of floating among cloud pictures. To glory in a prophetic vision of knowledge covering the earth is an easier exercise of believing imagination than to see its beginning in newspaper placards staring at you from the bridge beyond the cornfields. And it might well happen to most of us dainty people that we were in the thick of the battle of Armageddon without being aware of anything more than the annoyance of a little explosive smoke and struggling on the ground immediately about us. It lay in Deronda's nature usually to contemn the feeble, fastidious sympathy which shrinks from the broad life of mankind. But now, with Mirah before him as a living reality, whose experience he had to care for, he saw every common Jew and Jewess in the light of a comparison with her, and had a presentiment of the collision between her idea of the unknown mother and brother and the discovered fact, a presentiment all the keener in him because of a suppressed consciousness that a not unlikely possibility of collision might lie hidden in his own lot. Not that he would have looked with more complacency of expectation at wealthy Jews outdoing the lords of the Philistines in their sports, but since there was no likelihood of Mirah's friends being found among that class, their habits did not immediately affect him. In this mood he rambled without expectation of a more pregnant result than a little preparation of his own mind, perhaps for future theorizing as well as practice, very much as if, Mirah being related to Welsh miners, he had gone to look more closely at the ways of those people, not without wishing at the same time to get a little light of detail on the history of strikes. He really did not long to find anybody in particular, and when, as his habit was, he looked at the name over a shop door, he was well content that it was not Ezra Cohen. I confess he particularly desired that Ezra Cohen should not keep a shop. Wishes are held to be ominous, and according to which belief the order of the world is so arranged that if you have an impious objection to a squint, your offspring is the more likely to be born with one; also that if you happen to desire a squint, you would not get it. This desponding view of probability the hopeful entirely reject, taking their wishes as good and sufficient security for all kinds of fulfillment. Who is absolutely neutral? Deronda happening one morning to turn into a little side street out of the noise and obstructions of Holborn, felt the scale dip on the desponding side. He was rather tired of the streets, and had paused to hail a hansom cab which he saw coming, when his attention was caught by some fine old clasps in chased silver displayed in the window at his right hand. His first thought was that Lady Mallinger, who had a strictly Protestant taste for such Catholic spoils, might like to have these missal clasps turned into a bracelet. Then his eyes traveled over the other contents of the window, and he saw that the shop was that kind of pawnbroker's where the lead is given to jewelry, lace, and all equivocal objects introduced as bric-a-brac. A placard in one corner announced, "Watches and jewelry exchanged and repaired." But his survey had been noticed from within, and a figure appeared at the door, looking round at him and saying in a tone of cordial encouragement, "Good day, sir." The instant was enough for Deronda to see the face, unmistakably Jewish, belonging to a young man about 30, and wincing from the shopkeeper's persuasiveness that he would probably follow, he had no sooner returned the "good day" than he passed to the other side of the street and beckoned to the cabman to draw up there. From that station he saw the name over the shop window, Ezra Cohen. There might be 100 Ezra Cohens lettered above shop windows, but Deronda had not seen them. Probably the young man interested in a possible customer was Ezra himself, and he was about the age to be expected in Mirah's brother, who was grown up while she was still a little child. But Deronda's first endeavor as he drove homeward was to convince himself that there was not the slightest warrantable presumption of this Ezra being Mirah's brother; and next, that even if, in spite of good reasoning, he turned out to be that brother, while on inquiry the mother was found to be dead, it was not his, Deronda's, duty to make known the discovery to Mirah. In inconvenient disturbance of this conclusion there came his lately acquired knowledge that Mirah would have a religious desire to know of her mother's death, and also to learn whether her brother were living. How far was he justified in determining another life by his own notions? Was it not his secret complaint against the way in which others had ordered his own life, that he had not open daylight on all its relations, so that he had not, like other men, the full guidance of primary duties? The immediate relief from this inward debate was the reflection that he had not yet made any real discovery, and that by looking into the facts more closely he should be certified that there was no demand on him for any decision whatever. He intended to return to that shop as soon as he could conveniently, and buy the clasps for Lady Mallinger. But he was hindered for several days by Sir Hugo, who, about to make an after-dinner speech on a burning topic, wanted Deronda to forage for him on the legal part of the question, besides wasting time every day on argument which always ended in a drawn battle. As on many other questions they held different sides, but Sir Hugo did not mind this, and when Deronda put his point well, said, with a mixture of satisfaction and regret, "Confound it, Dan, why don't you make an opportunity of saying these things in public? You're wrong, you know. You won't succeed. You've got the massive sentiment, the heavy artillery of the country against you, but it's all the better ground for a young man to display himself on. When I was your age I should have taken it, and it would be quite as well for you to be in opposition to me here and there. It would throw you more into relief. If you would seize an occasion of this sort to make an impression, you might be in Parliament in no time, and you know that would gratify me." "I am sorry not to do what would gratify you, sir," said Deronda. but I cannot persuade myself to look at politics as a profession." "Why not? If a man is not born into public life by his position in the country, there is no way for him but to embrace it by his own efforts. The business of the country must be done, Her Majesty's government carried on, as the old Duke said. And it never could be, my boy, if everybody looked at politics as if they were prophecy, and demanded an inspired vocation. If you are to get into Parliament, it won't do to sit still and wait for a call either from heaven or constituents." "I don't want to make a living out of opinions," said Deronda, "especially out of borrowed opinions. Not that I mean to blame other men. I dare say many better fellows than I don't mind getting on to a platform to praise themselves and giving their word of honor for a party." "I'll tell you what, Dan," said Sir Hugo, "a man who sets his face against every sort of humbug is simply a three-cornered, impracticable fellow. There's a bad style of humbug, but there is also a good style, one that oils the wheels and makes progress possible. If you are to rule men, you must rule them through their own ideas. And I agree with the Archbishop at Naples who had a St. Januarius procession against the plague. It's no use having an order in council against popular shallowness. There is no action possible without a little acting." "One may be obliged to give way to an occasional necessity," said Deronda. "But it is one thing to say, 'In this particular case I am forced to put on this fool's cap and grin,' and another to buy a pocket fool's cap and practice myself in grinning. I can't see any real public expediency that does not keep an ideal before it which makes a limit of deviation from the direct path. But if I were to set up for a public man, I might mistake my success for public expediency." It was after this dialogue, which was rather jarring to him, that Deronda set out on his meditated second visit to Ezra Cohen's. He entered the street at the end opposite to the Holborn entrance, and in inward reluctance slackened his pace while his thoughts were transferring what he had just been saying about public expediency to the entirely private difficulty which brought him back again into this unattractive thoroughfare. It might soon become an immediate practical question with him how far he could call it a wise expediency to conceal the fact of close kindred. Such questions, turning up constantly in life, are often decided in a rough and ready way, and to many it will appear an over-refinement in Deronda that he should make any great point of a matter confined to his own knowledge. But we have seen the reasons why he had come to regard concealment as a bane of life, and the necessity of concealment as a mark by which lines of action were to be avoided. The prospect of being urged against the confirmed habit of his mind was naturally grating. He even paused here and there before the most plausible shop windows for a gentleman to look into, half inclined to decide that he would not increase his knowledge about that modern Ezra, who was certainly not a leader among his people, a hesitation which proved how, in a man much given to reasoning, a bare possibility may weigh more than the best clad likelihood. For Deronda's reasoning had decided that all likelihood was against this man's being Mirah's brother. One of the shop windows he paused before was that of a second-hand bookshop, where on a narrow table outside the literature of the ages was represented in judicious mixture, from the immortal verse of Homer to the mortal prose of the railway novel. That the mixture was judicious was apparent from Deronda's finding in it something that he wanted, namely, that wonderful bit of autobiography, the life of the Polish Jew, Salomon Maimon, which, as he could easily slip it into his pocket, he took from its place and entered the shop to pay for, expecting to see behind the counter a grimy personage showing that nonchalance about sales which seems to belong universally to the second-hand book business. In most other trades you find generous men who are anxious to sell you their wares for your own welfare, but even a Jew will not urge Simpson's Euclid on you with an affectionate assurance that you will have pleasure in reading it, and that he wishes he had 20 more of the article, so much is it in request. One is led to fear that a second-hand bookseller may belong to that unhappy class of men who have no belief in the good of what they get their living by, yet keep conscience enough to be morose rather than unctuous in their vocation. But instead of the ordinary tradesman, he saw on the dark background of books in the long narrow shop a figure that was somewhat startling in its unusualness. A man in threadbare clothing, whose age was difficult to guess from the dead yellowish flatness of the flesh, something like an old ivory carving, was seated on a stool against some bookshelves that projected beyond the short counter, doing nothing more remarkable than reading yesterday's Times. But when he let the paper rest on his lap and looked at the incoming customer, the thought glanced through Deronda that precisely such a physiognomy as that might possibly have been seen in a prophet of the exile, or in some new Hebrew poet of the medieval time. It was a fine typical Jewish face, wrought into intensity of expression apparently by a strenuous eager experience in which all the satisfaction had been indirect and far off, and perhaps by some bodily suffering also, which involved that absence of ease in the present. The features were clear cut, not large, the brow not high but broad and fully defined by the crisp black hair. It might never have been a particularly handsome face, but it must always have been forcible. And now, with its dark, far-off gaze and yellow pallor in relief on the gloom of the backward shop, one might have imagined one's self coming upon it in some past prison of the Inquisition, which a mob had suddenly burst upon; while the look fixed on an incidental customer seemed eager and questioning enough to have been turned on one who might have been a messenger either of delivery or of death. The figure was probably familiar and unexciting enough to the inhabitants of this street, but to Deronda's mind it brought so strange a blending of the unwonted with the common that there was a perceptible interval of mutual observation before he asked his question. "What is the price of this book?" After taking the book and examining the fly-leaves without rising, the supposed bookseller said, "There is no mark, and Mr. Ram is not in now. I am keeping the shop while he is gone to dinner. What are you disposed to give for it?" He held the book close on his lap with his hand on it, and looked examiningly at Deronda, over whom there came the disagreeable idea that possibly this striking personage wanted to see how much could be got out of a customer's ignorance of prices. But without further reflection he said, "Don't you know how much it is worth?" "Not its market price. May I ask, have you read it?" "No, I have read an account of it, which makes me want to buy it." "You are a man of learning. You are interested in Jewish history?" This was said in a deepened tone of eager inquiry. "I am certainly interested in Jewish history," said Deronda quietly, curiosity overcoming his dislike to the sort of inspection as well as questioning he was under. But immediately the strange Jew rose from his sitting posture, and Deronda felt a thin hand pressing his arm tightly, while a hoarse, excited voice, not much above a loud whisper, said, "You are perhaps of our race?" Deronda colored deeply, not liking the grasp, and then answered with a slight shake of the head, "No." The grasp was relaxed, the hand withdrawn, the eagerness of the face collapsed into an uninterested melancholy, as if some possessing spirit which had leaped into the eyes and gestures had sunk back again to the inmost recesses of the frame. And moving further off as he held out the little book, the stranger said in a tone of distant civility, "I believe Mr. Ram will be satisfied with half a crown, sir." The effect of this change on Deronda, he afterward smiled when he recalled it, was oddly embarrassing and humiliating, as if some high dignitary had found him deficient and given him his congé. There was nothing further to be said, however. He paid his half-crown and carried off his Salomon Maimon's Lebensgeschichte with a mere good morning. He felt some vexation at the sudden arrest of the interview, and the apparent prohibition that he should know more of this man, who was certainly something out of the common way, as different probably as a Jew could well be from Ezra Cohen, through whose door Deronda was presently entering, and whose flourishing face, glistening on the way to fatness, was hanging over the counter in negotiation with some one on the other side of the partition concerning 2 plated stoppers and 3 teaspoons, which lay spread before him. Seeing Deronda enter, he called out, "Mother! Mother!" and then with a familiar nod and smile said, "Coming, sir, coming directly." Deronda could not help looking toward the door from the back with some anxiety, which was not soothed when he saw a vigorous woman beyond 50 enter and approach to serve him. Not that there was anything very repulsive about her. The worst that could be said was that she had that look of having made her toilet with little water, and by twilight, which is common to unyouthful people of her class, and of having presumably slept in her large earrings, if not in her rings and necklace. In fact, what caused a sinking of heart in Deronda was, her not being so coarse and ugly as to exclude the idea of her being Mirah's mother. Any one who has looked at a face to try and discern signs of known kinship in it will understand his process of conjecture, how he tried to think away the fat which had gradually disguised the outlines of youth, and to discern what one may call the elementary expressions of the face. He was sorry to see no absolute negative to his fears. Just as it was conceivable that this Ezra, brought up to trade, might resemble the scapegrace father in everything but his knowledge and talent, so it was not impossible that this mother might have had a lovely refined daughter whose type of feature and expression was like Mirah's. The eyebrows had a vexatious similarity of line, and who shall decide how far a face may be masked when the uncherishing years have thrust it far onward in the ever new procession of youth and age? The good humor of the glance remained and shone out in a motherly way at Deronda as she said, in a mild guttural tone, "How can I serve you, sir?" "I should like to look at the silver clasps in the window," said Deronda. "The larger ones, please, in the corner there." They were not quite easy to get at from the mother's station, and the son, seeing this, called out, "I'll reach 'em, mother, I'll reach 'em," running forward with alacrity, and then handing the clasps to Deronda with the smiling remark, "Mother's too proud. She wants to do everything herself. That's why I called her to wait on you, sir. When there's a particular gentleman customer, sir, I daren't do any other than call her, but I can't let her do herself mischief with stretching." Here Mr. Cohen made way again for his parent, who gave a little guttural, amiable laugh while she looked at Deronda, as much as to say, "This boy will be at his jokes, but you see he's the best son in the world," and evidently the son enjoyed pleasing her, though he also wished to convey an apology to his distinguished customer for not giving him the advantage of his own exclusive attention. Deronda began to examine the clasps as if he had many points to observe before he could come to a decision. "They are only 3 guineas, sir," said the mother, encouragingly. "First-rate workmanship, sir. Worth twice the money. Only I get 'em a bargain from Cologne," said the son, parenthetically, from a distance. Meanwhile 2 new customers entered, and the repeated call, "Addie!" brought from the back of the shop a group that Deronda turned frankly to stare at, feeling sure that the stare would be held complimentary. The group consisted of a black-eyed young woman who carried a black-eyed little one, its head already covered with black curls, and deposited it on the counter, from which station it looked round with even more than the usual intelligence of babies. Also a robust boy of 6 and a younger girl, both with black eyes and black-ringed hair, looking more Semitic than their parents, as the puppy lions show the spots of far-off progenitors. The young woman answering to Addie, a sort of perroquet in a bright blue dress with coral necklace and earrings, her hair set up in a huge bush, looked as complacently lively and unrefined as her husband, and by a certain difference from the mother deepened in Deronda the unwelcome impression that the latter was not so utterly common a Jewess as to exclude her being the mother of Mirah. While that thought was glancing through his mind, the boy had run forward into the shop with an energetic stamp, and setting himself about 4 feet from Deronda, with his hands in the pockets of his miniature knickerbockers, looked at him with a precocious air of survey. Perhaps it was chiefly with a diplomatic design to linger and ingratiate himself that Deronda patted the boy's head, saying, "What is your name, sirrah?" "Jacob Alexander Cohen," said the small man, with much ease and distinctness. "You are not named after your father, then?" "No, after my grandfather. He sells knives and razors and scissors. My grandfather does," said Jacob, wishing to impress the stranger with that high connection. "He gave me this knife." Here a pocket knife was drawn forth, and the small fingers, both naturally and artificially dark, opened 2 blades and a corkscrew with much quickness. "Is not that a dangerous plaything?" said Deronda, turning to the grandmother. "He'll never hurt himself, bless you," said she, contemplating her grandson with placid rapture. "Have you got a knife?" says Jacob, coming closer. His small voice was hoarse in its glibness, as if it belonged to an aged commercial soul, fatigued with bargaining through many generations. "Yes, do you want to see it?" said Deronda, taking a small penknife from his waistcoat pocket. Jacob seized it immediately and retreated a little, holding the two knives in his palms and bending over them in meditative comparison. By this time the other clients were gone, and the whole family had gathered to the spot, centering their attention on the marvelous Jacob. The father, mother, and grandmother behind the counter, with baby held staggering thereon, and the little girl in front leaning at her brother's elbow to assist him in looking at the knives. "Mine's the best," said Jacob, at last, returning Deronda's knife as if he had been entertaining the idea of exchange and had rejected it. Father and mother laughed aloud with delight. "You won't find Jacob choosing the worst," said Mr. Cohen, winking, with much confidence in the customer's admiration. Deronda, looking at the grandmother, who had only an inward silent laugh, said, "Are these the only grandchildren you have?" "All. This is my only son," she answered in a communicative tone, Deronda's glance and manner as usual conveying the impression of sympathetic interest, which on this occasion answered his purpose well. It seemed to come naturally enough he should say, "And you have no daughter?" There was an instantaneous change in the mother's face. Her lips closed more firmly. She looked down, swept her hands outward on the counter, and finally turned her back on Deronda to examine some Indian handkerchiefs that hung in pawn behind her. Her son gave a significant glance, set up his shoulders an instant, and just put his fingers to his lips, then said quickly, "I think you're a first-rate gentleman in the city, sir, if I may be allowed to guess." "No," said Deronda, with a preoccupied air. "I have nothing to do with the city." "That's a bad job. I thought you might be the young principal of a first-rate firm," said Mr. Cohen, wishing to make amends for the check on his customer's natural desire to know more of him and his. "But you understand silver work, I see." "A little," said Deronda, taking up the clasps a moment and laying them down again. That unwelcome bit of circumstantial evidence had made his mind busy with a plan which was certainly more like acting than anything he had been aware of in his own conduct before. But the bare possibility that more knowledge might nullify the evidence now overpowered the inclination to rest in uncertainty. "To tell you the truth," he went on, "my errand is not so much to buy as to borrow. I dare say you go into rather heavy transactions occasionally." "Well, sir, I've accommodated gentlemen of distinction. I am proud to say it. I wouldn't exchange my business with any in the world. There's none more honorable, nor more charitable, nor more necessary for all classes, from the good lady who wants a little of the ready for the baker, to a gentleman like yourself, sir, who may want it for amusement. I like my business, I like my street, and I like my shop. I wouldn't have it a door further down, and I wouldn't be without a pawn shop, sir, to be the Lord Mayor. It puts you in connection with the world at large. I say it's like the government revenue. It embraces the brass as well as the gold of the country. And a man who doesn't get money, sir, can't accommodate. Now, what can I do for you, sir?" If an amiable self-satisfaction is the mark of earthly bliss, Solomon in all his glory was a pitiable mortal compared with Mr. Cohen, clearly one of those persons who, being in excellent spirits about themselves, are willing to cheer strangers by letting them know it. While he was delivering himself with lively rapidity, he took the baby from his wife, and holding it on his arm presented his features to be explored by its small fists. Deronda, not in a cheerful mood, was rashly pronouncing this Ezra Cohen to be the most unpoetic Jew he had ever met with in books or life. His phraseology was as little as possible like that of the Old Testament, and no shadow of a suffering race distinguished his vulgarity of soul from that of a prosperous pink and white huckster of the purest English lineage. It is naturally a Christian feeling that a Jew ought not to be conceited. However, this was no reason for not persevering in his project, and he answered at once in adventurous ignorance of technicalities. "I have a fine diamond ring to offer as security. Not with me at this moment, unfortunately, for I am not in the habit of wearing it, but I will come again this evening and bring it with me. £50 at once would be a convenience to me." "Well, you know, this evening is the Sabbath, young gentleman," said Cohen, "and I go to the shul. The shop will be closed." But accommodation is a work of charity. If you can't get here before, and are anyways pressed, why, I'll look at your diamond. You're perhaps from the West End, a longish drive? Yes, and your Sabbath begins early at this season. I could be here by 5. Will that do?" Deronda had not been without hope that by asking to come on a Friday evening he might get a better opportunity of observing points in the family character, and might even be able to put some decisive question. Cohen assented, and here the marvelous Jacob, whose physique supported a precocity that would have shattered a Gentile of his years, showed that he had been listening with much comprehension by saying, "You are coming again. Have you got any more knives at home?" "I think I have one," said Deronda, smiling down at him. "Has it 2 blades and a hook, and a white handle like that?" said Jacob, pointing to the waistcoat pocket. "I dare say it has." "Do you like a corkscrew?" said Jacob, exhibiting that article in his own knife again, and looking up with serious inquiry. "Yes," said Deronda, experimentally. "Bring your knife, then, and we'll swap," said Jacob, returning the knife to his pocket, and stamping about with the sense that he had concluded a good transaction. The grandmother had now recovered her usual manners, and the whole family watched Deronda radiantly when he caressingly lifted the little girl, to whom he had not hitherto given attention, and seating her on the counter, asked for her name also. She looked at him in silence, and put her fingers to her gold earrings, which he did not seem to have noticed. "Adelaide Rebekah is her name," said the mother proudly. "Speak to the gentleman, lovey." "Shalom Shabbos frock on," said Adelaide Rebekah. "Her Sabbath frock, she means," said the father, in explanation. "She'll have her Sabbath frock on this evening." "And will you let me see you in it, Adelaide?" said Deronda, with that gentle intonation which came very easily to him. "Say yes, lovey." "Yes, if you please, sir," said her mother, enchanted with this handsome young gentleman, who appreciated remarkable children. "And will you give me a kiss this evening?" said Deronda, with a hand on each of her little brown shoulders. Adelaide Rebekah, her miniature crinoline and monumental features corresponded with the combination of her names, immediately put up her lips to pay the kiss in advance, whereupon her father, rising in still more glowing satisfaction with the general meritoriousness of his circumstances, and with the stranger who was an admiring witness, said cordially, "You see there's somebody will be disappointed if you don't come this evening, sir. You won't mind setting down in our family place and waiting a bit for me if I'm not in when you come, sir? I'll stretch a bit to accommodate a gent of your sort. Bring the diamond, and I'll see what I can do for you." Deronda thus left the most favorable impression behind him as a preparation for more easy intercourse. But for his own part, those amenities had been carried on under the heaviest spirits. If these were really Mirah's relatives, he could not imagine that even her fervid filial piety could give the reunion with them any sweetness beyond such as could be found in the strict fulfillment of a painful duty. What did this vaunting brother need? And with the most favorable supposition about the hypothetic mother, Deronda shrank from the image of a first meeting between her and Mirah, and still more from the idea of Mirah's domestication with this family. He took refuge in disbelief. To find an Ezra Cohen when the name was running in your head was no more extraordinary than to find a Josiah Smith under like circumstances. And as to the coincidence about the daughter, it would probably turn out to be a difference. If, however, further knowledge confirmed the more undesirable conclusion, what would be wise expediency? To try and determine the best consequences by concealment, or to brave other consequences for the sake of that openness which is the sweet fresh air of our moral life. End of chapter 33. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 34.
Ist geheißen Israel, Ihn hat verwandelt Hexenspruch in einen Hund. Aber jeden Freitagabend in der Dämmerungsstunde plötzlich weicht der Zauber und der Hund wird aufs Neue ein menschlich Wesen. From Heine's Prinzessin Sabatz.
When Deronda arrived at 5 o'clock, the shop was closed and the door was opened for him by the Christian servant. When she showed him into the room behind the shop, he was surprised at the prettiness of the scene. The house was old and rather extensive at the back. Probably the large room he now entered was gloomy by daylight, but now it was agreeably lit by a fine old brass lamp with 7 oil lights hanging above the snow-white cloth spread on the central table. The ceiling and walls were smoky, and all the surroundings were dark enough to throw into relief the human figures, which had a Venetian glow of coloring. The grandmother was arrayed in yellowish brown with a large gold chain in lieu of the necklace, and by this light her yellow face with its darkly marked eyebrows and framing roll of gray hair looked as handsome as was necessary for picturesque effect. Young Mrs. Cohen was clad in red and black, with a string of large artificial pearls wound round and round her neck. The baby lay asleep in the cradle under a scarlet counterpane. Adelaide Rebekah was in braided amber, and Jacob Alexander was in a black velveteen with scarlet stockings. As the 4 pairs of black eyes all glistened a welcome at Deronda, he was almost ashamed of the supercilious dislike these happy-looking creatures had raised in him by daylight. Nothing could be more cordial than the greeting he received, and both mother and grandmother seemed to gather more dignity from being seen on the private hearth, showing hospitality. He looked round with some wonder at the old furniture. The oaken bureau and high side table must surely be mere matters of chance and economy, and not due to the family taste. A large dish of blue and yellow ware was set up on the side table, and flanking it were 2 old silver vessels. In front of them a large volume in darkened vellum with a deep-ribbed back. In the corner at the farther end was an open door into an inner room, where there was also a light. Deronda took in these details by parenthetic glances while he met Jacob's pressing solicitude about the knife. He had taken the pains to buy one with the requisites of the hook and white handle, and produced it on demand, saying, "Is that the sort of thing you want, Jacob?" It was subjected to a severe scrutiny. The hook and blades were opened, and the article of barter with the corkscrew was drawn forth for comparison. "Why do you like a hook better than a corkscrew?" said Deronda. "Gosh, I can get hold of things with a hook. A corkscrew won't go into anything but corks. But it's better for you. You can draw corks." "You agree to change, then?" said Deronda, observing that the grandmother was listening with delight. "What else have you got in your pockets?" said Jacob, with deliberative seriousness. "Hush, hush, Jacob love," said the grandmother, and Deronda, mindful of discipline, answered, "I think I must not tell you that. Our business was with knives." Jacob looked up into his face scanningly for a moment or two, and apparently arriving at his conclusion, said gravely, "I'll schwap," handing the corkscrew knife to Deronda, who pocketed it with corresponding gravity. Immediately the small son of Shem ran off into the next room, whence his voice was heard in rapid chat, and then ran back again, when, seeing his father enter, he seized a little velveteen hat which lay on a chair and put it on to approach him. Cohen kept on his own hat and took no notice of the visitor, but stood still while the 2 children went up to him and clasped his knees. Then he laid his hands on each in turn and uttered his Hebrew benediction, whereupon the wife, who had lately taken baby from the cradle, brought it up to her husband and held it under his outstretched hands to be blessed in its sleep. For the moment Deronda thought that this pawnbroker, proud of his vocation, was not utterly prosaic. "Well, sir, you found your welcome in my family, I think," said Cohen, putting down his hat and becoming his former self. "And you've been punctual. Nothing like a little stress here," he added, tapping his side pocket as he sat down. "It's good for us all in our turn. I've felt it when I've had to make up payments. I began to fit every sort of box. It's bracing to the mind. Now then, let us see, let us see. That is the ring I spoke of," said Deronda, taking it from his finger. "I believe it cost £100. It will be a sufficient pledge to you for 50, I think. I shall probably redeem it in a month or so." Cohen's glistening eyes seemed to get a little nearer together as he met the ingenuous look of this crude young gentleman, who apparently supposed that redemption was a satisfaction to pawnbrokers. He took the ring, examined and returned it, saying with indifference, "Good, good. We'll talk of it after our meal. Perhaps you'll join us, if you've no objection. Me and my wife will feel honored, and so will mother. Won't you, mother?" The invitation was doubly echoed, and Deronda gladly accepted it. All now turned and stood round the table. No dish was at present seen except one covered with a napkin, and Mrs. Cohen had placed a china bowl near her husband that he might wash his hands in it. But after putting on his hat again he paused, and called in a loud voice, "Mordecai!" "Can this be part of the religious ceremony?" thought Deronda, not knowing what might be expected of the ancient hero. But he heard a "yes" from the next room, which made him look toward the open door, and there, to his astonishment, he saw the figure of the enigmatic Jew whom he had this morning met with in the book-shop. Their eyes met, and Mordecai looked as much surprised as Deronda, neither in his surprise making any sign of recognition. But when Mordecai was seating himself at the end of the table, he just bent his head to the guest in a cold and distant manner, as if the disappointment of the morning remained a disagreeable association with this new acquaintance. Cohen now washed his hands, pronouncing Hebrew words the while. Afterward he took off the napkin covering the dish, and disclosed the two long flat loaves besprinkled with seed, the memorial of the manna that fed the wandering forefathers, and breaking off small pieces gave one to each of the family, including Adelaide Rebekah, who stood on the chair with her whole length exhibited in her amber-colored garment, her little Jewish nose lengthened by compression of the lip in the effort to make a suitable appearance. Cohen then uttered another Hebrew blessing, and after that the male heads were uncovered, all seated themselves, and the meal went on without any peculiarity that interested Deronda. He was not very conscious of what dishes he ate from, being preoccupied with the desire to turn the conversation in a way that would enable him to ask some leading question, and also thinking of Mordecai, between whom and himself there was an exchange of fascinated, half-furtive glances. Mordecai had no handsome Sabbath garment, but instead of the threadbare, rusty black coat of the morning, he wore one of light drab, which looked as if it had once been a handsome loose paletot, now shrunk with washing. And this change of clothing gave a still stronger accentuation to his dark-haired, eager face, which might have belonged to the prophet Ezekiel, also probably not modish in the eyes of contemporaries. It was noticeable that the thin tails of the fried fish were given to Mordecai, and in general the sort of share assigned to a poor relation, no doubt a survival of prehistoric practice, not yet generally admitted to be superstitious. Mr. Cohen kept up the conversation with much liveliness, introducing as subjects always in taste. The Jew is proud of his loyalty, the Queen and the royal family, the Emperor and the Empress of the French, into which both grandmother and wife entered with zest. Mrs. Cohen, the younger, showed an accurate memory of distinguished birthdays, and the elder assisted her son in informing the guest of what occurred when the Emperor and Empress were in England and visited the city 10 years before. "I dare say you know all about it better than we do, sir," said Cohen, repeatedly, by way of preface to full information, and the interesting statements were kept up in a trio. "Our baby is named Eugenie Esther," said young Mrs. Cohen vivaciously. "It's wonderful how the Emperor's like a cousin of mine in the face," said the grandmother. "It struck me like lightning when I caught sight of him. I couldn't have thought it." "Mother and me went to see the Emperor and Empress at the Crystal Palace," said Mr. Cohen. "I had a fine piece of work to take care of, mother. She might have been squeezed flat, though she was pretty near as lusty then as she is now. I said if I had 100 mothers I'd never take one of 'em to see the Emperor and Empress at the Crystal Palace again. And you may think a man can't afford it when he's got but one mother. Not if he'd ever so big an insurance on her." He stroked his mother's shoulder affectionately, and chuckled a little at his own humor. "Your mother has been a widow a long while, perhaps," said Deronda, seizing his opportunity. "That has made your care for her the more needful." "Aye, aye, it's a good many yortzeit since I had to manage for her and myself," said Cohen quickly. "I went to it early. It's that makes you a sharp knife." "What does? What makes a sharp knife, father?" said Jacob, his cheek very much swollen with sweet cake. The father winked at his guest and said, "Having your nose put on the grindstone." Jacob slipped from his chair with the piece of sweet cake in his hand, and going close up to Mordecai, who had been totally silent hitherto, said, "What does that mean, putting my nose to the grindstone?" "It means that you are to bear being hurt without making a noise," said Mordecai, turning his eyes benignantly on the small face close to his. Jacob put the corner of the cake into Mordecai's mouth as an invitation to bite, saying meanwhile, "I shan't, though," and keeping his eyes on the cake to observe how much of it went in this act of generosity. Mordecai took a bite and smiled, evidently meaning to please the lad, and the little incident made them both look more lovable. Deronda, however, felt with some vexation that he had taken little by his question. "I fancy that is the right quarter for learning," said he, carrying on the subject that he might have an excuse for addressing Mordecai, to whom he turned and said, "You have been a great student, I imagine." "I have studied," was the quiet answer. "And you? You know German by the book you were buying." "Yes, I have studied in Germany. Are you generally engaged in bookselling?" said Deronda. "No. I only go to Mr. Ram's shop every day to keep it while he goes to meals," said Mordecai, who was now looking at Deronda with what seemed a revival of his original interest. It seemed as if the face had some attractive indication for him which now neutralized the former disappointment. After a slight pause, he said, "Perhaps you know Hebrew?" "I am sorry to say, not at all." Mordecai's countenance fell. He cast down his eyelids, looking at his hands, which lay crossed before him, and said no more. Deronda had now noticed more decisively than in their former interview a difficulty in breathing, which he thought must be a sign of consumption. "I've had something else to do then to get book learning," said Mr. Cohen. "I've had to make myself knowing about useful things. I know stones well." Here he turned to Deronda's ring. "I'm not afraid of taking that ring of yours at my own valuation. But now," he added, with a certain drop in his voice to a lower, more familiar nasal, "what do you want for it?" "50 or 60 pounds," Deronda answered, rather too carelessly. Cohen paused a little, thrust his hands into his pockets, fixed on Deronda a pair of glistening eyes that suggested a miraculous guinea pig, and said, "Couldn't do you that. Happy to oblige, but couldn't go that lengths. 40 pound, say 40. I'll let you have 40 on it." Deronda was aware that Mordecai had looked up again at the words implying a monetary affair, and was now examining him again while he said, "Very well, I shall redeem it in a month or so." "Good! I'll make you out the ticket by and by," said Cohen, indifferently. Then he held up his finger as a sign that conversation must be deferred. He, Mordecai, and Jacob put on their hats, and Cohen opened a thanksgiving which was carried on by responses, till Mordecai delivered himself alone at some length in a solemn chanting tone, with his chin slightly uplifted and his thin hands clasped easily before him. Not only in his accent and tone, but in his freedom from the self-consciousness which has reference to others' approbation, there could hardly have been a stronger contrast to the Jew at the other end of the table. It was an unaccountable conjunction, the presence among these common, prosperous, shopkeeping types of a man who, in an emaciated, threadbare condition, imposed a certain awe on Deronda, and an embarrassment at not meeting his expectations. No sooner had Mordecai finished his devotional strain than rising, with a slight bend of his head to the stranger, he walked back into his room and shut the door behind him. "That seems to be a rather remarkable man," said Deronda, turning to Cohen, who immediately set up his shoulders, put out his tongue slightly, and tapped his own brow. It was clearly to be understood that Mordecai did not come up to the standard of sanity which was set by Mr. Cohen's view of men and things. "Does he belong to your family?" said Deronda. This idea appeared to be rather ludicrous to the ladies as well as to Cohen, and the family interchanged looks of amusement. "No, no," said Cohen. "Charity. Charity. He worked for me, and when he got weaker and weaker I took him in. He's an encumbrance, but he brings a blessing down, and he teaches the boy. Besides, he does the repairing at the watches and jewelry." Deronda hardly abstained from smiling at this mixture of kindliness and the desire to justify it in the light of a calculation. but his willingness to speak further of Mordecai, whose character was made the more enigmatically striking by these new details, was baffled. Mr. Cohen immediately dismissed the subject by reverting to the accommodation, which was also an act of charity, and proceeded to make out the ticket, get the £40, and present them both in exchange for the diamond ring. Deronda, feeling that it would be hardly delicate to protract his visit beyond the settlement of the business which was its pretext, had to take his leave, with no more decided result than the advance of £40 and the pawn ticket in his breast pocket, to make a reason for returning when he came up to town after Christmas. He was resolved that he would endeavor to gain a little more insight into the character and history of Mordecai, from whom also he might gather something decisive about the Cohens. For example, the reason why it was forbidden to ask Mrs. Cohen the elder whether she had a daughter. End of chapter 34. End of book 4. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Book 5. Mordecai. Chapter 35. Were uneasiness of conscience measured by extent of crime, human history had been different, and one should look to see the contrivers of greedy wars and the mighty marauders of the money market in one troop of self-lacerating penitents with the meaner robber and cut-purse, and the murderer that doth his butchery in small with his own hand. No doubt wickedness hath its rewards to distribute, but whoso wins in this devil's game must needs be baser, more cruel, more brutal than the order of this planet will allow for the multitude born of woman, the most of these carrying a form of conscience, a fear which is the shadow of justice, a pity which is the shadow of love, that hindereth from the prize of serene wickedness, itself difficult of maintenance in our composite flesh. On the 29th of December Deronda knew that the Grandcourts had arrived at the Abbey, but he had had no glimpse of them before he went to dress for dinner. There had been a splendid fall of snow, allowing the party of children the rare pleasures of snowballing and snow-building, and in the Christmas holidays the Mallinger girls were content with no amusement unless it were joined in and managed by Cousin, as they had always called Deronda. After that outdoor exertion he had been playing billiards, and thus the hours had passed without his dwelling at all on the prospect of meeting Gwendolen at dinner. Nevertheless, that prospect was interesting to him, and when a little tired and heated with working at amusement he went to his room before the half-hour bell had rung, he began to think of it with some speculation on the sort of influence her marriage with Grandcourt would have on her, and on the probability that there would be some discernible shades of change in her manner since he last saw her at Diplow, just as there had been since his first vision of her at Leubronn. "I fancy there are some natures one could see growing or degenerating every day if one watched them," was his thought. "I suppose some of us go on faster than others. And I am sure she is a creature who keeps strong traces of anything that has once impressed her. That little affair of the necklace, and the idea that somebody thought her gambling wrong, had evidently bitten into her. But such impressibility leads both ways. It may drive one to desperation as soon as to anything better. And whatever fascinations Grandcourt may have for capricious tastes, good heavens! Who can believe that he would call out the tender affections in daily companionship? One might be tempted to horsewhip him for the sake of getting some show of passion into his face and speech. I'm afraid she married him out of ambition, to escape poverty. But why did she run out of his way at first? The poverty came after, though. Poor thing, she may have been urged into it. How can one feel anything else than pity for a young creature like that, full of unused life, ignorantly rash, hanging all her blind expectations on that remnant of a human being? Doubtless the phrases which Deronda's meditation applied to the bridegroom were the less complimentary for the excuses and pity in which it clad the bride. His notion of Grandcourt as a remnant was founded on no particular knowledge, but simply on the impression which ordinary polite intercourse had given him that Grandcourt had worn out all his natural healthy interest in things. In general, one may be sure that whenever a marriage of any mark takes place, male acquaintances are likely to pity the bride, female acquaintances the bridegroom. Each, it is thought, might have done better, and especially where the bride is charming, young gentlemen on the scene are apt to conclude that she can have no real attachment to a fellow so uninteresting to themselves as her husband, but has married him on other grounds. Who, under such circumstances, pities the husband? Even his female friends are apt to think his position retributive. He should have chosen some one else. But perhaps Deronda may be excused that he did not prepare any pity for Grandcourt, who had never struck acquaintances as likely to come out of his experiences with more suffering than he inflicted. Whereas for Gwendolen, young, headlong, eager for pleasure, fed with the flattery which makes a lovely girl believe in her divine right to rule, how quickly might life turn from expectancy to a bitter sense of the irremediable. After what he had seen of her, he might have had rather dull feelings not to have looked forward with some interest to her entrance into the room. Still, since the honeymoon was already 3 weeks in the distance, and Gwendolen had been enthroned, not only at Ryelands, but at Diplow, she was likely to have composed her countenance with suitable manifestation or concealment, not being one who would indulge the curious by a helpless exposure of her feelings. A various party had been invited to meet the new couple. The old aristocracy was represented by Lord and Lady Pentreath, the old gentry by young Mr. and Mrs. Fitzadam of the Worcestershire branch of the Fitzadams, politics and the public good, as specialized in the cider interest, by Mr. Fenn, member for West Orchards, accompanied by his 2 daughters, Lady Mallinger's family, by her brother, Mr. Raymond and his wife, the useful bachelor element by Mr. Sinker, the eminent counsel, and by Mr. Vandernoodt, whose acquaintance Sir Hugo had found pleasant enough at Leubronn to be adopted in England. All had assembled in the drawing-room before the new couple appeared. Meanwhile the time was being passed chiefly in noticing the children, various little Raymonds, nephews and nieces of Lady Mallinger's, with her own 3 girls, who were always allowed to appear at this hour. The scene was really delightful, enlarged by full-length portraits with deep backgrounds inserted in the cedar paneling, surmounted by a ceiling that glowed with the rich colors of the coats of arms ranged between the sockets, illuminated almost as much by the red fire of oak boughs as by the pale wax lights, stilled by the deep-piled carpet and by the high English breeding that subdues all voices, while the mixture of ages, from the white-haired Lord and Lady Pentreath to the 4-year-old Edgar Raymond, gave a varied charm to the living groups. Lady Mallinger, with fair matronly roundness and mildly prominent blue eyes, moved about in her black velvet, carrying a tiny white dog on her arm as a sort of finish to her costume. The children were scattered among the ladies, while most of the gentlemen were standing rather aloof, conversing with that very moderate vivacity observable during the long minutes before dinner. Deronda was a little out of the circle in a dialogue fixed upon him by Mr. Vandernoodt, a man of the best Dutch blood imported at the Revolution. For the rest, one of those commodious persons in society who are nothing particular themselves, but are understood to be acquainted with the best in every department. Close-clipped, pale-eyed, nonchalant, as good a foil as could well be found to the intense coloring and vivid gravity of Deronda. He was talking of the bride and bridegroom, whose appearance was being waited for. Mr. Vandernoodt was an industrious gleaner of personal details, and could probably tell everything about a great philosopher or physicist, except his theories or discoveries. He was now implying that he had learned many facts about Grandcourt since meeting him at Leubronn. "Men who have seen a good deal of life don't always end by choosing their wives so well. He has had rather an anecdotic history. Gone rather deep into pleasures, I fancy, lazy as he is. But of course you know all about him." "No, really," said Deronda in an indifferent tone. "I know little more of him than that he is Sir Hugo's nephew." But now the door opened and deferred any satisfaction of Mr. Vandernoodt's communicativeness. The scene was one to set off any figure of distinction that entered on it, and certainly when Mr. and Mrs. Grandcourt entered, no beholder could deny that their figures had distinction. The bridegroom had neither more nor less easy perfection of costume, neither more nor less well-cut impassibility of face than before his marriage. It was to be supposed of him that he would put up with nothing less than the best in outward equipment, wife included, and the bride was what he might have been expected to choose. "By George, I think she's handsomer, if anything," said Mr. Vandernoodt, and Deronda was of the same opinion, but he said nothing. The white silk and diamonds, it may seem strange, but she did wear diamonds on her neck, in her ears, in her hair, might have something to do with the new imposingness of her beauty, which flashed on him as more unquestionable, if not more thoroughly satisfactory, than when he had first seen her at the gaming table. Some faces which are peculiar in their beauty are like original works of art. For the first time they are almost always met with question. But in seeing Gwendolen at Diplow, Deronda had discerned in her more than he had expected of that tender appealing charm which we call womanly. Was there any new change since then? He distrusted his impressions, but as he saw her receiving greetings with what seemed a proud cold quietude and a superficial smile, there seemed to be at work within her the same demonic force that had possessed her when she took him in her resolute glance and turned away a loser from the gaming table. There was no time for more of a conclusion, no time even for him to give his greeting before the summons to dinner. He sat not far from opposite to her at table, and could sometimes hear what she said in answer to Sir Hugo, who was at his liveliest in conversation with her. But though he looked toward her with the intention of bowing, she gave him no opportunity of doing so for some time. At last Sir Hugo, who might have imagined that they had already spoken to each other, said, "Deronda, you would like to hear what Mrs. Grandcourt tells me about your favorite klezmer." Gwendolen's eyelids had been lowered, and Deronda, already looking at her, thought he discovered a quivering reluctance as she was obliged to raise them and return his unembarrassed bow and smile, her own smile being one of the lip merely. It was but an instant, and Sir Hugo continued without pause. "The Arrowpoints have condoned the marriage, and he is spending the Christmas with his bride at Quetcham." "I suppose he will be glad of it for the sake of his wife, else I dare say he would not have minded keeping at a distance," said Deronda. "It's a sort of troubadour story," said Lady Pentreath, an easy, deep-voiced old lady. "I'm glad to find a little romance left among us. I think our young people now are getting too worldly wise." "It shows the Arrowpoints' good sense, however, to have adopted the affair after the fuss in the paper," said Sir Hugo. "And disowning your own child because of a mésalliance is something like disowning your own eye. Everybody knows it's yours, and you have no other to make an appearance with." "As to mésalliance, there's no blood on any side," said Lady Pentreath. "Old Admiral Arrowpoint was one of Nelson's men, you know, a doctor's son, and we all know how the mother's money came." "If there were any mésalliance in the case, I should say it was on Klesmer's side," said Deronda. "Ah, you think it is a case of the immortal marrying the mortal. What is your opinion?" said Sir Hugo, looking at Gwendolen. "I have no doubt that Herr Klesmer thinks himself immortal, but I dare say his wife will burn as much incense before him as he requires," said Gwendolen. She had recovered any composure that she might have lost. "Don't you approve of a wife burning incense before her husband?" said Sir Hugo, with an air of jocoseness. "Oh, yes," said Gwendolen, "if it were only to make others believe in him." She paused a moment, and then said with more gaiety, "When Herr Klesmer admires his own genius, it will take off some of the absurdity if his wife says Amen." "Klesmer is no favorite of yours, I see," said Sir Hugo. "I think very highly of him, I assure you," said Gwendolen. "His genius is quite above my judgment, and I know him to be exceedingly generous." She spoke with the sudden seriousness which is often meant to correct an unfair or indiscreet sally, having a bitterness against Klesmer in her secret soul which she knew herself unable to justify. Deronda was wondering what he should have thought of her if he had never heard of her before. Probably that she put on a little hardness and defiance by way of concealing some painful consciousness, if indeed he could imagine her manners otherwise than in the light of his suspicion. But why did she not recognize him with more friendliness? Sir Hugo, by way of changing the subject, said to her, Is not this a beautiful room? It was part of the refectory of the abbey. There was a division made by those pillars and the 3 arches, and afterward they were built up. Else it was half as large again originally. There used to be rows of Benedictines sitting where we are sitting. Suppose we were suddenly to see the lights burning low and the ghosts of the old monks rising behind all our chairs." "Please don't," said Gwendolen, with a playful shudder. "It is very nice to come after ancestors and monks, but they should know their places and keep underground. I should be rather frightened to go about this house all alone. I suppose the old generations must be angry with us because we have altered things so much." "Oh, the ghosts must be of all political parties," said Sir Hugo. "And those fellows who wanted to change things while they lived and couldn't do it must be on our side. But if you would not like to go over the house alone, you would like to go in company, I hope. You and Grandcourt ought to see it all, and we will ask Deronda to go found with us. He is more learned about it than I am." The baronet was in the most complaisant of humors. Gwendolen stole a glance at Deronda, who must have heard what Sir Hugo said, for he had his face turned toward them, helping himself to an entree, but he looked as impassive as a picture. At the notion of Deronda showing her and Grandcourt the place which was to be theirs, and which she with painful emphasis remembered might have been his, perhaps if others had acted differently, certain thoughts had rushed in, thoughts repeated within her, but now returning on an occasion embarrassingly new, and was conscious of something furtive and awkward in her glance, which Sir Hugo must have noticed. With her usual readiness of resource against betrayal, she said playfully, "You don't know how much I am afraid of Mr. Deronda." "How's that? Because you think him too learned?" said Sir Hugo, whom the peculiarity of her glance had not escaped. "No, it is ever since I first saw him at Leubronn, because when he came to look on at the roulette table I began to lose. He cast an evil eye on my play. He didn't approve it. He has told me so. And now whatever I do before him, I am afraid he will cast an evil eye upon it." "Gad, I'm rather afraid of him myself when he doesn't approve," said Sir Hugo, glancing at Deronda, and then turning his face toward Gwendolen, he said less audibly, "I don't think ladies generally object to have his eyes upon them." The baronet's small chronic complaint of facetiousness was at this moment almost as annoying to Gwendolen as it often was to Deronda. "I object to any eyes that are critical," she said, in a cool high voice, with a turn of her neck. "Are there many of these old rooms left in the Abbey?" "Not many. There is a fine cloistered court with a long gallery above it, but the finest bit of all is turned into stables. It is part of the old church. When I improved the place I made the most of every other bit, but it was out of my reach to change the stables, so the horses have the benefit of the fine old choir. You must go and see it." "I shall like to see the horses as well as the building," said Gwendolen. "Oh, I have no stud to speak of. Grandcourt will look with contempt at my horses," said Sir Hugo. "I've given up hunting, and go on in a jog-trot way, as becomes an old gentleman with daughters. The fact is, I went in for doing too much at this place. We all lived at Diplow for 2 years while the alterations were going on. Do you like Diplow?" "Not particularly," said Gwendolen, with indifference. One would have thought that the young lady had all her life had more family seats than she cared to go to. "Ah, it will not do after Ryelands," said Sir Hugo, well pleased. "Grandcourt, I know, took it for the sake of the hunting. But he found something so much better there," added the baronet, lowering his voice, "that he might well prefer it to any other place in the world." "It has one attraction for me," said Gwendolen, passing over this compliment with a chill smile, "that it is within reach of Offendene." "I understand that," said Sir Hugo, and then let the subject drop. What amiable baronet can escape the effect of a strong desire for a particular possession? Sir Hugo would have been glad that Grandcourt, with or without reason, should prefer any other place to Diplow; but inasmuch as in the pure process of wishing we can always make the conditions of our gratification benevolent, he did wish that Grandcourt's convenient disgust for Diplow should not be associated with his marriage with this very charming bride. Gwendolen was much to the baronet's taste, but as he observed afterward to Lady Mallinger, he should never have taken her for a young girl who had married beyond her expectations. Deronda had not heard much of this conversation, having given his attention elsewhere, but the glimpses he had of Gwendolen's manner deepened the impression that it had something newly artificial. Later, in the drawing-room, Deronda, at somebody's request, sat down to the piano and sang. Afterward Mrs. Raymond took his place, and on rising he observed that Gwendolen had left her seat and had come to his end of the room as if to listen more fully, but was now standing with her back to every one, apparently contemplating a fine cowled head carved in ivory which hung over a small table. He longed to go to her and speak. Why should he not obey such an impulse, as he would have done toward any other lady in the room? Yet he hesitated some moments, observing the graceful lines of her back, but not moving. If you have any reason for not indulging a wish to speak to a fair woman, it is a bad plan to look long at her back. The wish to see what it screens becomes the stronger. There may be a very sweet smile on the other side. Deronda ended by going to the end of the small table, at right angles to Gwendolen's position, but before he could speak she had turned on him no smile, but such an appealing look of sadness, so utterly different from the chill effort of her recognition at table, that his speech was checked. For what was an appreciative space of time to both, though the observation of others could not have measured it, they looked at each other, she seeming to take the deep rest of confession, he with an answering depth of sympathy that neutralized all other feelings. "Will you not join in the music?" he said, by way of meeting the necessity for speech. That her look of confession had been involuntary was shown by that just perceptible shake and change of countenance with which she roused herself to reply calmly, "I join in by listening. I am fond of music." "Are you not a musician?" "I have given a great deal of time to music, but I have not talent enough to make it worth while. I shall never sing again." "But if you are fond of music, it will always be worth while in private, for your own delight. I make it a virtue to be content with my middlingness," said Deronda, smiling. "It is always pardonable, so that one does not ask others to take it for superiority." "I cannot imitate you," said Gwendolen, recovering her tone of artificial vivacity. "To be middling with me is another phrase for being dull, and the worst fault I have to find with the world is that it is dull. Do you know, I'm going to justify gambling in spite of you. It is a refuge from dullness." "I don't admit the justification," said Deronda. "I think what we call the dullness of things is a disease in ourselves. Else how can any one find an intense interest in life? And many do." "Ah, I see. The fault I find in the world is my own fault," said Gwendolen, smiling at him. Then after a moment, looking up at the ivory again, she said, "Do you never find fault with the world or with others?" "Oh, yes, when I am in a grumbling mood." "And hate people? Confess you hate them when they stand in your way, when their gain is your loss. That is your own phrase, you know." "We are often standing in each other's way when we can't help it. I think it is stupid to hate people on that ground." "But if they injure you and could have helped it?" said Gwendolen, with a hard intensity unaccountable in incidental talk like this. Deronda wondered at her choice of subjects. A painful impression arrested his answer a moment, but at last he said, with a graver, deeper intonation, "Why, then, after all, I prefer my place to theirs." "There I believe you are right," said Gwendolen, with a sudden little laugh, and turned to join the group at the piano. Deronda looked round for Grandcourt, wondering whether he followed his bride's movements with any attention, but it was rather undiscerning to him to suppose that he could find out the fact. Grandcourt had a delusive mood of observing whatever had an interest for him, which could be surpassed by no sleepy-eyed animal on the watch for prey. At that moment he was plunged in the depth of an easy-chair, being talked to by Mr. Vandernoodt, who apparently thought the acquaintance of such a bridegroom worth cultivating. And an incautious person might have supposed it safe to telegraph secrets in front of him, the common prejudice being that your quick observer is one whose eyes have quick movements. Not at all. If you want a respectable witness who will see nothing inconvenient, choose a vivacious gentleman, very much on the alert, with two eyes wide open, a glass in one of them, and an entire impartiality as to the purpose of looking. If Grandcourt cared to keep any one under his power, he saw them out of the corners of his long, narrow eyes, and if they went behind him, he had a constructive process by which he knew what they were doing there. He knew perfectly well where his wife was and how she was behaving. Was he going to be a jealous husband? Deronda imagined that to be likely, but his imagination was as much astray about Grandcourt as it would have been about an unexplored continent where all the species were peculiar. He did not conceive that he himself was a likely subject of jealousy, or that he should give any pretext for it, but the suspicion that a wife is not happy naturally leads one to speculate on the husband's private deportment. And Deronda found himself after 1 o'clock in the morning in the rather ludicrous position of sitting up severely holding a Hebrew grammar in his hands, for somehow, in deference to Mordecai, he had begun to study Hebrew, with the consciousness that he had been in that attitude nearly an hour, and had thought of nothing but Gwendolen and her husband. To be an unusual young man means for the most part to get a difficult mastery over the usual, which is often like the sprite of ill luck you pack up your goods to escape from, and see grinning at you from the top of your luggage-van. The peculiarities of Deronda's nature had been acutely touched by the brief incident and words which made the history of his intercourse with Gwendolen, and this evening's slight addition had given them an importunate recurrence. It was not vanity, it was ready sympathy that had made him alive to a certain appealingness in her behavior toward him, and the difficulty with which she had seemed to raise her eyes to bow to him in the first instance was to be interpreted now by that unmistakable look of involuntary confidence which she had afterward turned on him under the consciousness of his approach. "What is the use of it all?" thought Deronda, as he threw down his grammar and began to undress. "I can't do anything to help her. Nobody can if she has found out her mistake already. And it seems to me that she has a dreary lack of the ideas that might help her. Strange and piteous to human flesh like that might be, wrapped round with fine raiment, her ears pierced for gems, her head held loftily, her mouth all smiling pretense, the poor soul within her sitting in a sick distaste of all things. But what do I know of her? There may be a demon in her to match the worst husband, for what I can tell. She was clearly an ill-educated, worldly girl. Perhaps she is a coquette." This last reflection, not much believed in, was a self-administered dose of caution, prompted partly by Sir Hugo's much contemned joking on the subject of flirtation. Deronda resolved not to volunteer any tête-à-tête with Gwendolen during the days of her stay at the Abbey, and he was capable of keeping a resolve in spite of much inclination to the contrary. But a man cannot resolve about a woman's actions, least of all about those of a woman like Gwendolen, in whose nature there was a combination of proud reserve with rashness, of perilously poised terror with defiance which might alternately flatter and disappoint control. Few words could less represent her than coquette. She had native love of homage and belief in her own power, but no cold artifice for the sake of enslaving. And the poor thing's belief in her power, with her other dreams before marriage, had often to be thrust aside now like the toys of a sick child, which it looks at with dull eyes and has no heart to play with, however it may try. The next day at lunch Sir Hugo said to her, "The thaw has gone on like magic, and it's so pleasant out of doors just now. Shall we go and see the stables and other odd bits about the place?" "Yes, pray," said Gwendolen. "You will like to see the stables, Henleigh?" she added, looking at her husband. "Uncommonly," said Grandcourt, with an indifference which seemed to give irony to the word, as he returned her look. It was the first time Deronda had seen them speak to each other since their arrival, and he thought their exchange of looks as cold or official as if it had been a ceremony to keep up a charter. Still the English fondness for reserve will account for much negation, and Grandcourt's manners with an extra veil of reserve over them might be expected to present the extreme type of the national taste. "Who else is inclined to make the tour of the house and premises?" said Sir Hugo. "The ladies must muffle themselves. There is only just about time to do it well before sunset. You will go, Dan, won't you?" "Oh yes," said Deronda, carelessly, knowing that Sir Hugo would think any excuse disobliging. "I'll meet in the library then when they are ready, say in half an hour," said the baronet. Gwendolen made herself ready with wonderful quickness, and in 10 minutes came down into the library in her sables, plume, and little thick boots. As soon as she entered the room she was aware that some one else was there. It was precisely what she had hoped for. Deronda was standing with his back toward her at the far end of the room, and was looking over a newspaper. How could little thick boots make any noise on an Axminster carpet? And to cough would have seemed an intended signaling which her pride could not condescend to. Also she felt bashful about walking up to him and letting him know that she was there, though it was her hunger to speak to him which had set her imagination on constructing this chance of finding him, and had made her hurry down, as birds hover near the water which they dare not drink. Always uneasily dubious about his opinion of her, she felt a peculiar anxiety to-day lest he might think of her with contempt, as one triumphantly conscious of being Grandcourt's wife, the future lady of this domain. It was her habitual effort now to magnify the satisfactions of her pride, on which she nourished her strength. But somehow Deronda's being there disturbed them all. There was not the faintest touch of coquetry in the attitude of her mind toward him. He was unique to her among men because he had impressed her as being not her admirer, but her superior. In some mysterious way he was becoming a part of her conscience, as one woman whose nature is an object of reverential belief may become a new conscience to a man. And now he would not look round and find out that she was there. The paper crackled in his hand, his head rose and sank, exploring those stupid columns, and he was evidently stroking his beard, as if this world were a very easy affair to her. Of course all the rest of the company would soon be down, and the opportunity of her saying something to efface her flippancy of the evening before would be quite gone. She felt sick with irritation. So fast do young creatures like her absorb misery through invisible suckers of their own fancies, and her face had gathered that peculiar expression which comes with a mortification to which tears are forbidden. At last he threw down the paper and turned round. "Oh, you are there already," he said, coming forward a step or two. "I must go and put on my coat." He turned aside and walked out of the room. This was behaving quite badly. Mere politeness would have made him stay to exchange some words before leaving her alone. It was true that Grandcourt came in with Sir Hugo immediately afterward, so that the words must have been too few to be worth anything. As it was, they saw him walking from the library door. "Ah, you look rather ill," said Grandcourt, going straight up to her, standing in front of her and looking into her eyes. "Do you feel equal to the walk?" "Yes, I shall like it," said Gwendolen, without the slightest movement except this of the lips. "We could put off going over the house, you know, and only go out of doors," said Sir Hugo kindly, while Grandcourt turned aside. "Oh dear no," said Gwendolen, speaking with determination. "Let us put off nothing. I want a long walk." The rest of the walking party, 2 ladies and 2 gentlemen besides Deronda, had now assembled, and Gwendolen rallying went with due cheerfulness by the side of Sir Hugo, paying apparently an equal attention to the commentaries Deronda was called upon to give on the various architectural fragments, to Sir Hugo's reasons for not attempting to remedy the mixture of the undisguised modern with the antique, which in his opinion only made the place the more truly historical. On their way to the buttery and kitchen they took the outside of the house, and paused before a beautiful pointed doorway, which was the only remnant in the east front. "Well, now, to my mind," said Sir Hugo, "that is more interesting standing as it is in the middle of what is frankly 4 centuries later, than if the whole front had been dressed up in a pretense of the 13th century. Additions ought to smack of the time when they are made, and carry the stamp of their period. I wouldn't destroy any old bits, but that notion of reproducing the old is a mistake, I think. At least if a man likes to do it he must pay for his whistle. Besides, where are you to stop along that road, making loopholes where you don't want to peep, and so on? You may as well ask me to wear out the stones with kneeling. Eh, Grandcourt?" "A confounded nuisance," drawled Grandcourt. "I hate fellows wanting to howl litanies, acting the greatest bores that have ever existed." "Well, yes, that's what their romanticism must come to," said Sir Hugo, in a tone of confidential assent. "That is, if they carry it out logically." "I think that way of arguing against a course because it may be ridden down to an absurdity would soon bring life to a standstill," said Deronda. "It is not the logic of human action, but of a roasting jack, that must go on to the last turn when it has been once wound up. We can do nothing safely without some judgment as to where we are to stop." "I find the rule of the pocket the best guide," said Sir Hugo, laughingly. "And as for most of your new old building, you had need to hire men to scratch and chip it all over artistically to give it an elderly looking surface, which at the present rate of labor would not answer." "Do you want to keep up the old fashions, then, Mr. Deronda?" said Gwendolen, taking advantage of the freedom of grouping to fall back a little, while Sir Hugo and Grandcourt went on. "Some of them. I don't see why we should not use our choice there as we do elsewhere, or why either age or novelty by itself is an argument for or against. To delight in doing things because our fathers did them is good if it shuts out nothing better. It enlarges the range of affection, and affection is the broadest basis of good in life." "Do you think so?" said Gwendolen, with a little surprise. "I should have thought you cared most about ideas, knowledge, wisdom, and all that." "But to care about them is a sort of affection," said Deronda, smiling at her sudden naivete. "Call it attachment, interest, willing to bear a great deal for the sake of being with them and saving them from injury. Of course it makes a difference if the objects of interest are human beings. But generally in all deep affections the objects are a mixture, half persons and half ideas. Sentiments and affections flow in together." "I wonder whether I understand that," said Gwendolen, putting up her chin in her old saucy manner. "I believe I am not very affectionate. Perhaps you mean to tell me that is the reason why I don't see much good in life." "No, I did not mean to tell you that. But I admit that I should think it true if I believed what you say of yourself," said Deronda, gravely. Here Sir Hugo and Grandcourt turned round and paused. "I never can get Mr. Deronda to pay me a compliment," said Gwendolen. "I have quite a curiosity to see whether a little flattery can be extracted from him." "Ah," said Sir Hugo, glancing at Deronda, "the fact is, it is useless to flatter a bride. We give it up in despair. She has been so fed on sweet speeches that everything we say seems tasteless." "Quite true," said Gwendolen, bending her head and smiling. "Mr. Grandcourt won me by neatly turned compliments. If there had been one word out of place, it would have been fatal." "Do you hear that?" said Sir Hugo, looking at the husband. "Yes," said Grandcourt, without change of countenance. "It's a deucedly hard thing to keep up, though." All this seemed to Sir Hugo a natural playfulness between such a husband and wife, but Deronda wondered at the misleading alternations in Gwendolen's manner, which at one moment seemed to excite sympathy by childlike indiscretion, at another to repel it by proud concealment. He tried to keep out of her way by devoting himself to Miss Juliet Fenn, a young lady whose profile had been so unfavorably decided by circumstances over which she had no control, that Gwendolen some months ago had felt it impossible to be jealous of her. Nevertheless, when they were seeing the kitchen, a part of the original building in perfect preservation, the depth of shadow in the niches of the stone walls and groined vault, the play of light from the huge glowing fire on polished tin, brass, and copper, the fine resonance that came with every sound of voice or metal, were all spoiled for Gwendolen, and Sir Hugo's speech about them was made rather importunate because Deronda was discoursing to the other ladies and kept at a distance from her. It did not signify that the other gentlemen took the opportunity of being near her. Of what use in the world was their admiration while she had an uneasy sense that there was some standard in Deronda's mind which measured her into littleness? Mr. Vandernoodt, who had the mania of always describing one thing while you were looking at another, was quite intolerable with his insistence on Lord Blow's kitchen, which he had seen in the north. "Pray don't ask us to see two kitchens at once. It makes the heat double. I must really go out of it," she cried at last, marching resolutely into the open air and leaving the others in the rear. Grandcourt was already out, and as she joined him, he said, "I wondered how long you meant to stay in that damned place," one of the freedoms he had assumed as husband being the use of his strongest epithets. Gwendolen, turning to see the rest of the party approach, said, "It was certainly rather too warm in one's wraps." They walked on the gravel across a green court, where the snow still lay in islets on the grass, and in masses on the boughs of the great cedar and the crenellated coping of the stone walls, and then into a larger court, where there was another cedar, to find the beautiful choir long ago turned into stables, in the first instance, perhaps, after an impromptu fashion by troopers who had a pious satisfaction in insulting the priests of Baal and the images of Ashtoreth, the queen of heaven. The exterior, its west end save for the stable door, walled in with brick and covered with ivy, was much defaced, maimed of finial and gargoyle, the friable limestone broken and fretted, and lending its soft gray to a powdery dark lichen. The long windows, too, were filled in with brick as far as the springing of the arches. The broad clerestory windows, with wire or ventilating blinds, with the low wintry afternoon sun upon it, sending shadows from the cedar boughs, and lighting up the touches of snow remaining on every ledge, it had still a scarcely disturbed aspect of antique solemnity, which gave the scene in the interior rather a startling effect. Though ecclesiastical or reverential indignation apart, the eyes could hardly help dwelling with pleasure on its piquant picturesqueness. Each finely arched chapel was turned into a stall, where in the dusty glazing of the windows there still gleamed patches of crimson, orange, blue, and palest violet. For the rest, the choir had been gutted, the floor leveled, paved, and drained according to the most approved fashion, and a line of loose boxes erected in the middle. A soft light fell from the upper windows on sleek brown or gray flanks and haunches, on mild equine faces looking out with active nostrils over the varnished brown boarding, on the hay hanging from racks where the saints once looked down from the altar-pieces, and on the pale golden straw scattered or in heaps, on a little white and liver-colored spaniel making his bed on the back of an elderly hackney, and on 4 ancient angels, still showing signs of devotion like mutilated martyrs, while over all the grand pointed roof, untouched by reforming wash, showed its lines and colors mysteriously through veiling shadow and cobweb, and a hoof now and then striking against the board seemed to fill the vault with thunder, while outside there was the answering bay of the bloodhounds. "Oh, this is glorious!" Gwendolen burst forth, in forgetfulness of everything but the immediate impression. There had been a little intoxication for her in the grand spaces of courts and building, and the fact of her being an important person among them. "This is glorious! Oh, I wish there were a horse in every one of the boxes. I would 10 times rather have these stables than those at Diplow." But she had no sooner said this than some consciousness arrested her, and involuntarily she turned her eyes toward Deronda, who oddly enough had taken off his felt hat and stood holding it before him as if they had entered a room or an actual church. He, like others, happened to be looking at her, and their eyes met, to her intense vexation, for it seemed to her that by looking at him she had betrayed the reference of her thoughts, and she felt herself blushing. She exaggerated the impression that even Sir Hugo, as well as Deronda, would have of her bad taste in referring to the possession of anything at the Abbey. As for Deronda, she had probably made him despise her. Her annoyance at what she imagined to be the obviousness of her confusion robbed her of her usual facility in carrying it off by a playful speech, and turning up her face to look at the roof, she wheeled away in that attitude. If any had noticed her blush as significant, they had certainly not interpreted it by the secret windings and recesses of her feeling. A blush is no language, only a dubious flag signal which may mean either of 2 contradictories. Deronda alone had a faint guess at some part of her feeling, but while he was observing her, he was himself under observation. "Do you take your hat off to horses?" said Grandcourt, with a slight sneer. "Why not?" said Deronda, covering himself. He had really taken off the hat automatically, and if he had been an ugly man might doubtless have done so with impunity, ugliness having naturally the air of involuntary exposure and beauty of display. Gwendolen's confusion was soon merged in the survey of the horses, which Grandcourt politely abstained from appraising, languidly assenting to Sir Hugo's alternate depreciation and eulogy of the same animal as one that he should not have bought when he was younger, and piqued himself on his horses, but yet one that had better qualities than many more expensive brutes. The fact is, stables dive deeper and deeper into the pocket nowadays, and I am very glad to have got rid of that démangeaison," said Sir Hugo, as they were coming out. "What is a man to do, though?" said Grandcourt. "He must ride. I don't see what else there is to do. And I don't call it riding to sit astride a set of brutes with every deformity under the sun." This delicate diplomatic way of characterizing Sir Hugo's stud did not require direct notice, and the baronet, feeling that the conversation had worn rather thin, said to the party generally, "Now we are going to see the cloister, the finest bit of all, in perfect preservation. The monks might have been walking there yesterday." But Gwendolen had lingered behind to look at the kenneled bloodhounds, perhaps because she felt a little dispirited, and Grandcourt waited for her. "You had better take my arm," he said, in his low tone of command, and she took it. "It is a great bore being dragged about in this way, and no cigar," said Grandcourt. "I thought you would like it." "Like it? One eternal chatter, and encouraging those ugly girls, inviting one to meet such monsters. How that fat Deronda can bear looking at her!" "Why do you call him fat? Do you object to him so much?" "Object? No. What do I care about his being a fat? It's of no consequence to me. I'll invite him to Diplow again if you like." "I don't think he would come. He is too clever and learned to care about us," said Gwendolen, thinking it useful for her husband to be told privately that it was possible for him to be looked down upon. "I never saw that make much difference in a man. Either he is a gentleman or he is not," said Grandcourt. That a new husband and wife should snatch a moment's tête-à-tête was what could be understood and indulged, and the rest of the party left them in the rear, till, re-entering the garden, they all paused in that cloistered court where, among the falling rose-petals 13 years before, we saw a boy becoming acquainted with his first sorrow. This cloister was built of a harder stone than the church, and had been in greater safety from the wearing weather. It was a rare example of a northern cloister with arched and pillared openings not intended for glazing, and the delicately wrought foliage of the capital seemed still to carry the very touches of the chisel. Gwendolen had dropped her husband's arm and joined the other ladies, to whom Deronda was noticing the delicate sense which had combined freedom with accuracy in the imitation of natural forms. "I wonder whether one oftener learns to love real objects through their representations, or the representations through the real objects," he said, after pointing out a lovely capital made by the curled leaves of greens, showing their reticulated underside with the firm gradual swell of its central rib. "When I was a little fellow these capitals taught me to observe and delight in the structure of leaves." "I suppose you can see every line of them with your eyes shut," said Juliet Fenn. "Yes, I was always repeating them, because for a good many years this court stood for me as my only image of a convent, and whenever I read of monks and monasteries, this was my scenery for them." "You must love this place very much," said Miss Fenn, innocently, not thinking of inheritance. "So many homes are like 20 others, but this is unique, and you seem to know every cranny of it. I dare say you could never love another home so well." "Oh, I carry it with me," said Deronda quietly, being used to all possible thoughts of this kind. "To most men their early home is no more than a memory of their early years, and I'm not sure that they have the best of it. The image is never marred. There's no disappointment in memory, and one's exaggerations are always on the good side." Gwendolen felt sure that he spoke in that way out of delicacy to her and Grandcourt, because he knew they must hear him, and that he probably thought of her as a selfish creature who only cared about possessing things in her own person. But whatever he might say, it must have been a secret hardship to him that any circumstances of his birth had shut him out from the inheritance of his father's position, and if he supposed that she exulted in her husband's taking it, what could he feel for her but scornful pity? Indeed, it seemed clear to her that he was avoiding her, and preferred talking to others, which nevertheless was not kind in him. With these thoughts in her mind she was prevented by a mixture of pride and timidity from addressing him again, and when they were looking at the rows of quaint portraits in the gallery above the cloisters, she kept up her air of interest and made her vivacious remarks without any direct appeal to Deronda. But at the end she was very weary of her assumed spirits, and Grandcourt turned into the billiard room, and she went to the pretty boudoir which had been assigned to her, and shut herself up to look melancholy at her ease. No chemical process shows a more wonderful activity than the transforming influence of the thoughts we imagine to be going on in another. Changes in theory, religion, admirations may begin with a suspicion of dissent or disapproval, even when the grounds of disapproval are but matter of searching conjecture. Poor Gwendolen was conscious of an uneasy transforming process, all the old nature shaken to its depths, its hopes spoiled, its pleasures perturbed, but still showing wholeness and strength in the will to reassert itself. After every new shock of humiliation she tried to adjust herself and seize her old supports: proud concealment, trust in new excitements that would make life go by without much thinking, trust in some deed of reparation to nullify her self-blame and shield her from a vague, ever-visiting dread of some horrible calamity, trust in the hardening effect of use and wont that would make her indifferent to her miseries. Yes, miseries. This beautiful, healthy young creature, with her 22 years and her gratified ambition, no longer felt inclined to kiss her fortunate image in the glass. She looked at it with wonder that she could be so miserable. One belief which had accompanied her through her unmarried life as a self-cajoling superstition, encouraged by the subordination of every one about her, the belief in her own power of dominating, was utterly gone. Already, in 7 short weeks, which seemed half her life, her husband had gained a mastery which she could no more resist than she could have resisted the benumbing effect from the touch of a torpedo. Gwendolen's will had seemed imperious in its small girlish sway, but it was the will of a creature with a large discourse of imaginative fears. A shadow would have been enough to relax its hold. And she had found a will like that of a crab or a boa constrictor, which goes on pinching or crushing without alarm at thunder. Not that Grandcourt was without calculation of the intangible effects which were the chief means of mastery. Indeed, he had a surprising acuteness in detecting that situation of feeling in Gwendolen which made her proud and rebellious spirit dumb and helpless before him. She had burned Lydia Glasher's letter with an instantaneous terror lest other eyes should see it, and had tenaciously concealed from Grandcourt that there was any other cause of her violent hysterics than the excitement and fatigue of the day. She had been urged into an implied falsehood. "Don't ask me. It was my feeling about everything. It was the sudden change from home." The words of that letter kept repeating themselves, and hung on her consciousness with the weight of a prophetic doom. "I am the grave in which your chance of happiness is buried as well as mine. You had your warning. You have chosen to injure me and my children. He had meant to marry me. He would have married me at last if you had not broken your word. You will have your punishment. I desire it with all my soul. Will you give him this letter to set him against me and ruin us more, me and my children? Shall you like to stand before your husband with these diamonds on you, and these words of mine in his thoughts and yours? Will he think you have any right to complain when he has made you miserable? You took him with your eyes open. The willing wrong you have done me will be your curse." The words had nestled their venomous life within her and stirred continually the vision of the scene at the Whispering Stones. That scene was now like an accusing apparition. She dreaded that Grandcourt should know of it. So far out of her sight now was that possibility she had once satisfied herself with, of speaking to him about Mrs. Glasher and her children and making them rich amends. Any endurance seemed easier than the mortal humiliation of confessing that she knew all before she married him, and in marrying him had broken her word. For the reasons by which she had justified herself when the marriage tempted her, and all her easy arrangement of her future power over her husband to make him do better than he might be inclined to do, were now as futile as the burned-out lights which set off a child's pageant. Her sense of being blameworthy was exaggerated by a dread both definite and vague. The definite dread was lest the veil of secrecy should fall between her and Grandcourt, and give him the right to taunt her. With the reading of that letter had begun her husband's empire of fear. And her husband all the while knew it. He had not indeed any distinct knowledge of her broken promise, and would not have rated highly the effect of that breach on her conscience, but he was aware not only of what Lush had told him about the meeting at the Whispering Stones, but also of Gwendolen's concealment as to the cause of her sudden illness. He felt sure that Lydia had enclosed something with the diamonds, and that this something, whatever it was, had at once created in Gwendolen a new repulsion for him, and a reason for not daring to manifest it. He did not greatly mind, or feel as many men might have felt, that his hopes in marriage were blighted. He had wanted to marry Gwendolen, and he was not a man to repent. Why should a gentleman whose other relations in life are carried on without the luxury of sympathetic feeling be supposed to require that kind of condiment in domestic life? What he chiefly felt was that a change had come over the conditions of his mastery, which, far from shaking it, might establish it the more thoroughly. And it was established. He judged that he had not married a simpleton unable to perceive the impossibility of escape or to see alternative evils. He had married a girl who had spirit and pride enough not to make a fool of herself by forfeiting all the advantages of a position which had attracted her. And if she wanted pregnant hints to help her in making up her mind properly, he would take care not to withhold them. Gwendolen, indeed, with all that gnawing trouble in her consciousness, had hardly for a moment dropped the sense that it was her part to bear herself with dignity and appear what is called happy. In disclosure of disappointment or sorrow she saw nothing but a humiliation which would have been vinegar to her wounds. Whatever her husband might have come at last to be to her, she meant to wear the yoke so as not to be pitied. For she did think of the coming years with presentiment. She was frightened at Grandcourt. The poor thing had passed from her girlish sauciness of superiority over this inert specimen of personal distinction into an amazed perception of her former ignorance about the possible mental attitude of a man toward the woman he sought in marriage, of her present ignorance as to what their life with each other might turn into. For novelty gives immeasurableness to fear, and fills the early time of all sad changes with phantoms of the future. Her little coquetries, voluntary or involuntary, had told on Grandcourt during courtship, and formed a medium of communication between them, showing him in the light of a creature such as she could understand and manage. But marriage had nullified all such interchange, and Grandcourt had become a blank uncertainty to her in everything but this, that he would do just what he willed, and that she had neither devices at her command to determine his will, nor any rational means of escaping it. What had occurred between them and her wearing the diamonds was typical. One evening shortly before they came to the Abbey they were going to dine at Brackenshaw Castle. Gwendolen had said to herself that she would never wear those diamonds. They had horrible words clinging and crawling about them as from some bad dream whose images lingered on the perturbed sense. She came down dressed in her white, with only a streak of gold and a pendant of emeralds which Grandcourt had given her, round her neck, and the little emerald stars in her ears. Grandcourt stood with his back to the fire and looked at her as she entered. "Am I altogether as you like?" she said, speaking rather gaily. She was not without enjoyment in this occasion of going to Brackenshaw Castle with her new dignities upon her, as men whose affairs are sadly involved will enjoy dining out among persons likely to be under a pleasant mistake about them. "No," said Grandcourt. Gwendolen felt suddenly uncomfortable, wondering what was to come. She was not prepared for some struggle about the diamonds. But suppose he were going to say in low contemptuous tones, "You are not in any way that I like." It was very bad for her to be secretly hating him, but it would be much worse when he gave the first sign of hating her. "Oh, mercy!" she exclaimed, the pause lasting till she could bear it no longer. "How am I to alter myself?" "Put on the diamonds," said Grandcourt, looking straight at her with his narrow glance. Gwendolen paused in her turn, afraid of showing any emotion, and feeling that nevertheless there was some change in her eyes as they met his. but she was obliged to answer, and said as indifferently as she could, "Oh, please not. I don't think diamonds suit me." "What you think has nothing to do with it," said Grandcourt, his sotto voce imperiousness seeming to have an evening quietude and finish like his toilette. "I wish you to wear the diamonds." "Pray excuse me, I like these emeralds," said Gwendolen, frightened in spite of her preparation. That white hand of his which was touching his whisker was capable, she fancied, of clinging round her neck and threatening to throttle her; for her fear of him, mingling with the vague foreboding of some retributive calamity which hung about her life, had reached a superstitious point. "Oblige me by telling me your reason for not wearing the diamonds when I desire it," said Grandcourt. His eyes were still fixed upon her, and she felt her own eyes narrowing under them as if to shut out an entering pain. Of what use was the rebellion within her? She could say nothing that would not hurt her worse than submission. Turning, slowing, and covering herself again, she went to her dressing-room. As she reached out the diamonds, it occurred to her that her unwillingness to wear them might have already raised a suspicion in Grandcourt that she had some knowledge about them which he had not given her. She fancied that his eyes showed a delight in torturing her. How could she be defiant? She had nothing to say that would touch him, nothing but what would give him a more painful grasp on her consciousness. "He delights in making the dogs and horses quail. That is half his pleasure in calling them his," she said to herself, as she opened the jewel case with a shivering sensation. "It will come to be so with me, and I shall quail. What else is there for me? I will not say to the world, 'Pity me.'" She was about to ring for her maid when she heard the door open behind her. It was Grandcourt who came in. "You want some one to fasten them," he said, coming toward her. She did not answer, but simply stood still, leaving him to take out the ornaments and fasten them as he would. Doubtless he had been used to fasten them on some one else. With a bitter sort of sarcasm against herself, Gwendolen thought, "What a privilege this is to have robbed another woman of." "What makes you so cold?" said Grandcourt, when he had fastened the last earring. "Pray put plenty of furs on. I hate to see a woman come into a room looking frozen. If you are to appear as a bride at all, appear decently." This martial speech was not exactly persuasive, but it touched the quick of Gwendolen's pride and forced her to rally. The words of the bad dream crawled about the diamonds still, but only for her. To others they were brilliants that suited her perfectly, and Grandcourt inwardly observed that she answered to the rein. "Oh yes, mamma, quite happy," Gwendolen had said on her return to Diplow. "Not at all disappointed in Ryelands. It is a much finer place than this, larger in every way. But don't you want some more money?" "Did you not know that Mr. Grandcourt left me a letter on your wedding day? I am to have 800 a year. He wishes me to keep Offendene for the present while you are at Diplow. But if there were some pretty cottage near the park at Ryelands, we might live there without much expense, and I should have you most of the year perhaps." "We must leave that to Mr. Grandcourt, mamma." "Oh, certainly. It is exceedingly handsome of him to say that he will pay the rent for Offendene till June, and we can go on very well, without any manservant except Crane, just for out of doors. Our good Mary will stay with us and help me to manage everything. It is natural that Mr. Grandcourt should wish me to live in a good style of house in your neighborhood, and I cannot decline. So he said nothing about it to you?" "No, he wished me to hear it from you, I suppose." Gwendolen, in fact, had been very anxious to have some definite knowledge of what would be done for her mother, but at no moment since her marriage had she been able to overcome the difficulty of mentioning the subject to Grandcourt. Now, however, she had a sense of obligation which would not let her rest without saying to him, "It is very good of you to provide for mamma. You took a great deal on yourself in marrying a girl who had nothing but relations belonging to her." Grandcourt was smoking, and only said carelessly, "Of course I was not going to let her live like a gamekeeper's mother." "At least he is not mean about money," thought Gwendolen, "and mamma is the better off for my marriage." She often pursued the comparison between what might have been if she had not married Grandcourt, and what actually was, trying to persuade herself that life generally was barren of satisfaction, and that if she had chosen differently she might now have been looking back with a regret as bitter as the feeling she was trying to argue away. Her mother's dullness, which used to irritate her, she was at present inclined to explain as the ordinary result of woman's experience. True, she still saw that she would manage differently from mamma, but her management now only meant that she would carry her troubles with spirit, and let none suspect them. By and by she promised herself that she should get used to her heart sores, and find excitements that would carry her through life, as a hard gallop carried her through some of the morning hours. There was gambling. She had heard stories at Leubronn of fashionable women who gambled in all sorts of ways. It seemed very flat to her at this distance, but perhaps if she began to gamble again the passion might awake. Then there was the pleasure of producing an effect by her appearance in society. What did celebrated beauties do in town when their husbands could afford display? All men were fascinated by them. They had a perfect equipage and toilette, walked into public places and bowed and made the usual answers and walked out again. Perhaps they bought china and practiced accomplishments. If she could only feel a keen appetite for those pleasures, could only believe in pleasure as she used to do. Accomplishments had ceased to have the exciting quality of promising any preeminence to her. And as for fascinated gentlemen, adorers who might hover round her with languishment and diversify married life with the romantic stir of mystery, passion, and danger, which her French reading had given her some girlish notion of, they presented themselves to her imagination with the fatal circumstance that, instead of fascinating her in return, they were clad in their own weariness and disgust. The admiring male, rashly adjusting the expression of his features and the turn of his conversation to her supposed tastes, had always been an absurd object to her, and at present seemed rather detestable. Many courses are actually pursued, follies and sins both convenient and inconvenient, without pleasure or hope of pleasure. But to solace ourselves with imagining any course beforehand, there must be some foretaste of pleasure in the shape of appetite. And Gwendolen's appetite had sickened. Let her wander over the possibilities of her life as she would, an uncertain shadow dogged her. Her confidence in herself and her destiny had turned into remorse and dread. She trusted neither herself nor her future. This hidden helplessness gave fresh force to the hold Deronda had from the first taken on her mind, as one who had an unknown standard by which he judged her. Had he some way of looking at things which might be a new footing for her, an inward safeguard against possible events which she dreaded as stored up retribution? It is one of the secrets in that change of mental poise which has been fitly named conversion, that to many among us neither heaven nor earth has any revelation till some personality touches theirs with a peculiar influence, subduing them into receptiveness. It had been Gwendolen's habit to think of the persons around her as stale books, too familiar to be interesting. Deronda had lit up her attention with a sense of novelty, not by words only, but by imagined facts. His influence had entered into the current of that self-suspicion and self-blame which awakens a new consciousness. "I wish he could know everything about me without my telling him," was one of her thoughts, as she sat leaning over the end of a couch, supporting her head in her hand and looking at herself in a mirror, not in admiration, but in a sad kind of companionship. "I wish he knew that I am not so contemptible as he thinks me, that I am in deep trouble, and want to be something better if I could." Without the aid of sacred ceremony or costume, her feelings had turned this man, only a few years older than herself, into a priest, a sort of trust less rare than the fidelity that guards it. Young reverence for one who is also young is the most coercive of all. There is the same level of temptation, and the higher motive is believed in as a fuller force, not suspected to be a mere residue from weary experience. But the coercion is often stronger on the one who takes the reverence. Those who trust us educate us. And perhaps in that ideal consecration of Gwendolen's, some education was being prepared for Deronda. End of chapter 35. This recording is in the public domain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Daniel Deronda by George Eliot. Chapter 36.
Rien ne pèse tant qu'un secret, le porter loin est difficile aux dames. Et je sais mesme sur ce fait bon nombre d'hommes qui sont femmes. La Fontaine.
Meanwhile Deronda had been fastened and led off by Mr. Vandernoodt, who wished for a brisker walk, a cigar, and a little gossip. Since we cannot tell a man his own secrets, the restraint of being in his company often breeds a desire to pair off in conversation with some more ignorant person, and Mr. Vandernoodt presently said, "What a washed-out piece of cambric Grandcourt is! But if he is a favorite of yours, I withdraw the remark." "Not the least in the world," said Deronda. "I thought not. One wonders how he came to have a great passion again, and he must have had, to marry in this way, though Lush, his old chum, hints that he married this girl out of obstinacy. By George, it was a very accountable obstinacy. A man might make up his mind to marry her without the stimulus of contradiction. But he must have made himself a pretty large drain of money, eh?" "I know nothing of his affairs." "What! Not of the other establishment he keeps up?" "Diplow? Of course. He took that of Sir Hugo, but merely for the year." "No, no, not Diplow. Gadsmere. Sir Hugo knows, I'll answer for it." Deronda said nothing. He really began to feel some curiosity, but he foresaw that he should hear what Mr. Vandernoodt had to tell, without the condescension of asking. "Lush would not altogether own to it, of course. He's a confidant and go-between of Grandcourt's. But I have it on the best authority. The fact is, there's another lady with 4 children at Gadsmere. She has had the upper hand of him these 10 years and more, and by what I can understand has it still. Left her husband for him, and used to travel with him everywhere. Her husband's dead now. I found a fellow who was in the same regiment with him and knew this Mrs. Glasher before she took wing. A fiery, dark-eyed woman, a noted beauty at that time. He thought she was dead. They say she has Grandcourt under her thumb still, and it's a wonder he didn't marry her, for there's a very fine boy, and I understand Grandcourt can do absolutely as he pleases with the estates. Lush told me as much as that." "What right had he to marry this girl?" said Deronda, with disgust. Mr. Vandernoodt, adjusting the end of his cigar, shrugged his shoulders and put out his lips. "She can know nothing of it," said Deronda emphatically. But that positive statement was immediately followed by an inward query. Could she have known anything of it? "It's rather a piquant picture," said Mr. Vandernoodt, "Grandcourt between 2 fiery women. For depend upon it, this light-haired one has plenty of devil in her. I formed that opinion of her at Leubronn. It's a sort of Medea and Creusa business. Fancy the 2 meeting! Grandcourt is a new kind of Jason. I wonder what sort of a part he'll make of it. It's a dog's part at best. I think I hear Ristori now saying, 'Jason! Jason!' These fine women generally get hold of a stick." "Grandcourt can bite, I fancy," said Deronda. "He is no stick." "No, no, I meant Jason. I can't quite make out Grandcourt, but he's a keen fellow enough, uncommonly well built, too. And if he comes into all this property, the estates will bear dividing. This girl, whose friends had come to beggary, I understand, may think herself lucky to get him. I don't want to be hard on a man because he gets involved in an affair of that sort, but he might make himself more agreeable. I was telling him a capital story last night, and he got up and walked away in the middle. I felt inclined to kick him. Do you suppose that is inattention or insolence now?" "Oh, a mixture. He generally observes the forms, but he doesn't listen much," said Deronda. Then after a moment's pause he went on, "I should think there must be some exaggeration or inaccuracy in what you have heard about this lady at Gadsmere." "Not a bit, depend upon it. It has all lain snug of late years. People have forgotten all about it. But there the nest is, and the birds are in it. And I know Grandcourt goes there. I have good evidence that he goes there. However, that's nobody's business but his own. The affair has sunk below the surface." "I wonder you could have learned so much about it," said Deronda, rather dryly. "Oh, there are plenty of people who knew all about it, but such stories get packed away like old letters. They interest me. I like to know the manners of my time—contemporary gossip, not antediluvian. These dry-as-dust fellows get a reputation by raking up some small scandal about Semiramis or Nymph of Greece. Then we have 1,001 poems written upon it by all the warblers, big and little. But I don't care a straw about the faux pas of the mummies. You do, though. You are one of the historical men, more interested in a lady when she's got a rag face and skeleton toes peeping out. Does that flatter your imagination? Well, if she had any woes in her love, one has the satisfaction of knowing that she's well out of them. Ah, you are thinking of the Medea, I see." Deronda then chose to point to some giant oaks worth looking at in their bareness. He also felt an interest in this piece of contemporary gossip, but he was satisfied that Mr. Vandernoodt had no more to tell about it. Since the early days when he tried to construct the hidden story of his own birth, his mind had perhaps never been so active in weaving probabilities about any private affair as it had now begun to be about Gwendolen's marriage. This unavowed relation of Grandcourt's—could she have gained some knowledge of it which caused her to shrink from the match, a shrinking finally overcome by the urgence of poverty? He could recall almost every word she had said to him, and in certain of these words he seemed to discern that she was conscious of having done some wrong, inflicted some injury. His own acute experience made him alive to the form of injury which might affect the unavowed children and their mother. Was Mrs. Grandcourt, under all her determined show of satisfaction, gnawed by a double, a treble-headed grief, self-reproach, disappointment, jealousy? He dwelt especially on all the slight signs of self-reproach. He was inclined to judge her tenderly, to excuse, to pity. He thought he had found a key now by which to interpret her more clearly. What magnifying of her misery might not a young creature get into who had wedded her fresh hopes to old secrets? He thought he saw clearly enough now why Sir Hugo had never dropped any hint of this affair to him, and immediately the image of this Mrs. Glasher became painfully associated with his own hidden birth. Gwendolen, knowing of that woman and her children, marrying Grandcourt, and showing herself contented, would have been among the most repulsive of beings to him. But Gwendolen, tasting the bitterness of remorse for having contributed to their injury, was brought very near to his fellow feeling. If it were so, she had got to a common plane of understanding with him on some difficulties of life which a woman is rarely able to judge of with any justice or generosity. For according to precedent, Gwendolen's view of her position might easily have been no other than that her husband's marriage with her was his entrance on the path of virtue, while Mrs. Glasher represented his forsaken sin, and Deronda had naturally some resentment on behalf of the Hagars and Ishmaels. Undeniably, Deronda's growing solicitude about Gwendolen depended chiefly on her peculiar manner toward him, and I suppose neither man nor woman would be the better for an utter insensibility to such appeals. One sign that his interest in her had changed its footing was that he had dismissed any caution against her being a coquette setting snares to involve him in a vulgar flirtation, and determined that he would not again evade any opportunity of talking to her. He had shaken off Mr. Vandernoodt and got into a solitary corner in the twilight, but half an hour was long enough to think of those possibilities in Gwendolen's position and state of mind, and on forming the determination not to avoid her, he remembered that she was likely to be at tea with the other ladies in the drawing-room. The conjecture was true, for Gwendolen, after resolving not to go down again for the next 4 hours, began to feel at the end of one that in shutting herself up she missed all chances of seeing and hearing, and that her visit would only last 2 more days. She adjusted herself, put on her little air of self-possession, and going down, made herself resolutely agreeable. Only ladies were assembled, and Lady Pentreath was amusing them with a description of a drawing-room under the Regency, and the figure that was cut by ladies and gentlemen in 1819, the year she was presented, when Deronda entered. "Shall I be acceptable?" he said. "Perhaps I had better go back and look for the others. I suppose they are in the billiard-room." "No, no, stay where you are," said Lady Pentreath. "They were all getting tired of me. Let us hear what you have to say." "That is rather an embarrassing appeal," said Deronda, drawing up a chair near Lady Mallinger's elbow at the tea-table. "I think I had better take the opportunity of mentioning our songstress," he added, looking at Lady Mallinger, "unless you have done so." "Oh, the little Jewess!" said Lady Mallinger. "No, I have not mentioned her. It never entered my mind that any one here wanted singing lessons." "All ladies know some one else who wants singing lessons," said Deronda. "I have happened to find an exquisite singer." Here he turned to Lady Pentreath. "She is living with some ladies who are friends of mine, the mother and sisters of a man who was my chum at Cambridge. She was on the stage at Vienna, but she wants to leave that life and maintain herself by teaching." "There are swarms of those people, aren't there?" said the old lady. "Are her lessons to be very cheap or very expensive? Those are the two baits I know of." "There is another bait for those who hear her," said Deronda. "Her singing is something quite exceptional, I think. She has had such first-rate teaching, or rather first-rate instinct with her teaching, that you might imagine her singing all came by nature." "Why did she leave the stage, then?" said Lady Pentreath. "I'm too old to believe in first-rate people giving up first-rate chances." "Her voice was too weak. It is a delicious voice for a room. You who put up with my singing of Schubert would be enchanted with hers," said Deronda, looking at Mrs. Raymond. "And I imagine she would not object to sing at private parties or concerts. Her voice is quite equal to that." "I am to have her in my drawing room when we go up to town," said Lady Mallinger. "You shall hear her then. I have not heard her myself yet, but I trust Daniel's recommendation. I mean my girls to have lessons of her." "Is it a charitable affair?" said Lady Pentreath. "I can't bear charitable music." Lady Mallinger, who was rather helpless in conversation, and felt herself under an engagement not to tell anything of Mirah's story, had an embarrassed smile on her face, and glanced at Deronda. "It is a charity to those who want to have a good model of feminine singing," said Deronda. "I think everybody who has ears would benefit by a little improvement on the ordinary style. If you heard Miss Lapidoth"—here he looked at Gwendolen—"perhaps you would revoke your resolution to give up singing." "I should rather think my resolution would be confirmed," said Gwendolen. "I don't feel able to follow your advice of enjoying my own middlingness." "For my part," said Deronda, "people who do anything finely always inspirit me to try. I don't mean that they make me believe I can do it as well, but they make the thing, whatever it may be, seem worthy to be done. I can bear to think my own music not good for much, but the world would be more dismal if I thought music itself not good for much. Excellence encourages one about life generally. It shows the spiritual wealth of the world. But then if we can't imitate it, it only makes our own life seem tamer," said Gwendolen, in a mood to resent encouragement founded on her own insignificance. "That depends on the point of view, I think," said Deronda. "We should have a poor life of it if we were reduced for all our pleasure to our own performances. A little private imitation of what is good is a sort of private devotion to it, and most of us ought to practice art only in the light of private study—preparation to understand and enjoy what the few can do for us. I think Miss Lapidoth is one of the few." "She must be a very happy person, don't you think?" said Gwendolen, with a touch of sarcasm and a turn of her neck toward Mrs. Raymond. "I don't know," answered the independent lady. "I must hear more of her before I say that." "It may have been a bitter disappointment to her that her voice failed her for the stage," said Juliet Fenn, sympathetically. "I suppose she's past her best, though," said the deep voice of Lady Pentreath. "On the contrary, she has not reached it," said Deronda. "She is barely 20." "And very pretty," interposed Lady Mallinger, with an amiable wish to help Deronda. "And she has very good manners. I'm sorry she's a bigoted Jewess. I should not like it for anything else, but it doesn't matter in singing." "Well, since her voice is too weak for her to scream much, I'll tell Lady Clementina to set her on my 9 granddaughters," said Lady Pentreath, "and I hope she'll convince 8 of them that they have not voice enough to sing anywhere but at church. My notion is that many of our girls nowadays want lessons not to sing." "I have had my lessons in that," said Gwendolen, looking at Deronda. "You see Lady Pentreath is on my side." While she was speaking, Sir Hugo entered with some of the other gentlemen, including Grandcourt, and standing against the group at the low tea table, said, "What imposition is Deronda putting on you, ladies? slipping in among you by himself, wanting to pass off an obscurity on us as better than any celebrity," said Lady Pentreath. "A pretty singing Jewess who is to astonish these young people. You and I, who heard Catalani in her prime, are not so easily astonished." Sir Hugo listened with his good-humored smile as he took a cup of tea from his wife, and then said, "Well, you know, a Liberal is bound to think that there have been singers since Catalani's time. Ah, you are younger than I am. I dare say you are one of the men who ran after Alcharisi, but she married off and left you all in the lurch." "Yes, yes, it is rather too bad when these great singers marry themselves into silence before they have a crack in their voices, and the husband is a public robber. I remember Leroux saying, 'A man might as well take down a fine peal of church bells and carry them off to the steps,'" said Sir Hugo, setting down his cup and turning away, while Deronda, who had moved from his place to make room for others, and felt that he was not in request, sat down a little apart. Presently he became aware that in the general dispersion of the room Gwendolen had extricated herself from the attentions of Mr. Vandernoodt, and had walked to the piano, where she stood apparently examining the music which lay on the desk. Will any one be surprised at Deronda's concluding that she wished him to join her? Perhaps she wanted to make amends for the unpleasant tone of resistance with which she had met his recommendation of Mirah, for he had noticed that her first impulse often was to say what she afterward wished to retract. He went to her side and said, "Are you relenting about the music, and looking for something to play or sing?" "I am not looking for anything, but I am relenting," said Gwendolen, speaking in a submissive tone. "May I know the reason?" "I should like to hear Miss Lapidoth and have lessons from her, since you admire her so much. That is, of course, when we go to town. I mean lessons in rejoicing at her excellence and my own deficiency," said Gwendolen, turning on him a sweet, open smile. "I shall be really glad for you to see and hear her," said Deronda, returning the smile in kind. "Is she as perfect in everything else as in her music?" "I can't vouch for that exactly. I have not seen enough of her. But I have seen nothing in her that I would wish to be different. She has had an unhappy life. Her troubles began in early childhood, and she has grown up among very painful surroundings. But I think you will say that no advantages could have given her more grace and truer refinement." "I wonder what sort of troubles hers were." "I have not any very precise knowledge, but I know that she was on the brink of drowning herself in despair." "And what hindered her?" said Gwendolen, quickly, looking at Deronda. "Some ray or other came which made her feel that she ought to live, that it was good to live," he answered quietly. "She is full of piety, and seems capable of submitting to anything when it takes the form of duty." "Those people are not to be pitied," said Gwendolen, impatiently. "I have no sympathy with women who are always doing right. I don't believe in their great sufferings." Her fingers moved quickly among the edges of the music. "It is true," said Deronda, "that the consciousness of having done wrong is something deeper, more bitter. I suppose we faulty creatures can never feel so much for the irreproachable as for those who are bruised in the struggle with their own faults. It is a very ancient story, that of the lost sheep, but it comes up afresh every day." "That is a way of speaking. It is not acted upon. It is not real," said Gwendolen, bitterly. "You admire Miss Lapidoth because you think her blameless, perfect, and you know you would despise a woman who had done something you thought very wrong." "That would depend entirely upon her own view of what she had done," said Deronda. "You would be satisfied if she were very wretched, I suppose," said Gwendolen, impetuously. "No, not satisfied. Full of sorrow for her. It was not a mere way of speaking. I did not mean to say that the finer nature is not more adorable. I mean that those who would be comparatively uninteresting beforehand may become worthier of sympathy when they do something that awakens in them a keen remorse. Lives are enlarged in different ways. I dare say some would never get their eyes opened if it were not for a violent shock from the consequences of their own actions. And when they are suffering in that way one must care for them more than for the comfortably self-satisfied." Deronda forgot everything but his vision of what Gwendolen's experience had probably been, and urged by compassion let his eyes and voice express as much interest as they would. Gwendolen had slipped on to the music-stool and looked up at him with pain in her long eyes, like a wounded animal asking for help. "Are you persuading Mrs. Grandcourt to play to us, Dan?" said Sir Hugo, coming up and putting his hand on Deronda's shoulder with a gentle admonitory pinch. "I cannot persuade myself," said Gwendolen, rising. Others had followed Sir Hugo's lead, and there was an end of any liability to confidences for that day. But the next was New Year's Eve, and a grand dance, to which the chief tenants were invited, was to be held in the picture gallery above the cloister, the sort of entertainment in which numbers and general movement may create privacy. When Gwendolen was dressed, she longed, in remembrance of Leubronn, to put on the old turquoise necklace for her sole ornament. But she dared not offend her husband by appearing in that shabby way on an occasion when he would demand her utmost splendor. Determined to wear the memorial necklace somehow, she wound it thrice round her wrist and made a bracelet of it, having gone to her room to put it on just before the time of entering the ball-room. It was always a beautiful scene, this dance on New Year's Eve, which had been kept up by the family tradition as nearly in the old fashion as inexorable change would allow. Red carpet was laid down for the occasion. Hothouse plants and evergreens were arranged in bowers at the extremities and in every recess of the gallery, and the old portraits, stretching back through generations, even to the pre-portraying period, made a piquant line of spectators. Some neighboring gentry, major and minor, were invited, and it was certainly an occasion when a prospective master and mistress of abbots and King's Topping might see their future glory in an agreeable light, as a picturesque provincial supremacy, with a rent-roll personified by the most prosperous-looking tenants. Sir Hugo expected Grandcourt to feel flattered by being asked to the Abbey at a time which included this festival in honor of the family estate. But he also hoped that his own hale appearance might impress his successor with the probable length of time that would elapse before the succession came, and with the wisdom of preferring a good actual sum to a minor property that must be waited for. All present, down to the least important farmer's daughter, knew that they were to see young Grandcourt, Sir Hugo's nephew, the presumptive heir and future baronet, now visiting the Abbey with his bride after an absence of many years. Any coolness between uncle and nephew having, it is understood, given way to a friendly warmth. The bride opening the ball with Sir Hugo was necessarily the cynosure of all eyes. And less than a year before, if some magic mirror could have shown Gwendolen her actual position, she would have imagined herself moving in it with a glow of triumphant pleasure, conscious that she held in her hands a life full of favorable chances which her cleverness and spirit would enable her to make the most of. And now she was wondering that she could get so little joy out of the exaltation to which she had been suddenly lifted, away from the distasteful petty empire of her girlhood with its irksome lack of distinction and superfluity of sisters. She would have been glad to be even unreasonably elated, and to forget everything but the flattery of the moment. But she was like one courting sleep, in whom thoughts insist like willful tormentors. Wondering in this way at her own dullness, and all the while longing for an excitement that would deaden importunate aches, she was passing through files of admiring beholders in the country dance with which it was tradition to open the ball, and was being generally regarded by her own sex as an enviable woman. It was remarked that she carried herself with a wonderful air, considering that she had been nobody in particular, and without a farthing to her fortune. If she had been a duke's daughter or one of the royal princesses, she could not have taken the honors of the evening more as a matter of course. Poor Gwendolen! It would by and by become a sort of skill in which she was automatically practiced to hear this last great gambling loss with an air of perfect self-possession. The next couple that passed were also worth looking at. Lady Pentreath had said, "I shall stand up for one dance, but I shall choose my partner. Mr. Deronda, you are the youngest man. I mean to dance with you. Nobody is old enough to make a good pair with me. I must have a contrast." And the contrast certainly set off the old lady to the utmost. She was one of those women who are never handsome till they are old, and she had had the wisdom to embrace the beauty of age as early as possible. What might have seemed harshness in her features when she was young had turned now into a satisfactory strength of form and expression which defied wrinkles, and was set off by a crown of white hair. Her well-built figure was well covered with black drapery, her ears and neck comfortably caressed with lace, showing none of those withered spaces which one would think it a pitiable condition of poverty to expose. She glided along gracefully enough, her dark eyes still with a mischievous smile in them as she observed the company. Her partner's young richness of tint against the flattened hues and rougher forms of her aged head had an effect something like that of a fine flower against a lichenous branch. Perhaps the tenants hardly appreciated this pair. Lady Pentreath was nothing more than a straight, active old lady. Mr. Deronda was a familiar figure regarded with friendliness, but if he had been the heir it would have been regretted that his face was not as unmistakably English as Sir Hugo's. Grandcourt's appearance when he came up with Lady Mallinger was not impeached with foreignness. Still the satisfaction in it was not complete. It would have been matter of congratulation if one who had the luck to inherit two old family estates had had more hair, a fresher color, and a look of greater animation. But that fine families dwindled off into females, and estates ran together into the single heirship of a mealy complexioned male, was a tendency in things which seemed to be accounted for by a citation of other instances. It was agreed that Mr. Grandcourt could never be taken for anything but what he was, a born gentleman, and that in fact he looked like an heir. Perhaps the person least complacently disposed toward him at that moment was Lady Mallinger, to whom going in procession up this country dance with Grandcourt was a blazonment of herself as the infelicitous wife who had produced nothing but daughters, little better than no children, poor dear things, except for her own fondness and for Sir Hugo's wonderful goodness to them. But such inward discomfort could not prevent the gentle lady from looking fair and stout to admiration, or her full blue eyes from glancing mildly at her neighbors. All the mothers and fathers held it a thousand pities that she had not had a fine boy, or even several, which might have been expected, to look at her when she was first married. The gallery included only 3 sides of the quadrangle, the fourth being shut off as a lobby or corridor. One side was used for dancing, and the opposite side for the supper table, while the intermediate part was less brilliantly lit and fitted with comfortable seats. Later in the evening Gwendolen was in one of these seats, and Grandcourt was standing near her. They were not talking to each other. She was leaning backward in her chair and he against the wall, and Deronda, happening to observe this, went up to ask her if she had resolved not to dance any more. Having himself been doing hard duty in this way among the guests, he thought he had earned the right to sink for a little while into the background, and he had spoken little to Gwendolen since their conversation at the piano the day before. Grandcourt's presence would only make it the easier to show that pleasure in talking to her even about trivialities which would be a sign of friendliness. And he fancied that her face looked blank. A smile beamed over it as she saw him coming, and she raised herself from her leaning posture. Grandcourt had been grumbling at the ennui of staying so long in this stupid dance, and proposing that they should vanish. She had resisted on the ground of politeness, not without being a little frightened at the probability that he was silently angry with her. She had her reason for staying, though she had begun to despair of the opportunity for the sake of which she had put the old necklace on her wrist. But now at last Deronda had come. "Yes, I shall not dance any more. Are you not glad?" she said, with some gaiety. "You might have felt obliged humbly to offer yourself as a partner, and I feel sure you have danced more than you like already." "I will not deny that," said Deronda, "since you have danced as much as you like. But will you take trouble for me in another way, and fetch me a glass of that fresh water?" It was but a few steps that Deronda had to go for the water. Gwendolen was wrapped in the lightest, softest of her white woolen burnouses, under which her hands were hidden. While he was gone she had drawn off her glove, which was finished with a lace ruffle, and when she put up her hand to take the glass and lifted it to her mouth, the necklace bracelet, which in its triple winding adapted itself clumsily to her wrist, was necessarily conspicuous. Grandcourt saw it, and saw that it was attracting Deronda's notice. "What is that hideous thing you have got on your wrist?" said the husband. "That," said Gwendolen composedly, pointing to the turquoises while she still held the glass. "It is an old necklace I like to wear. I lost it once, and some one found it for me." With that she gave the glass again to Deronda, who immediately carried it away, and on returning said, in order to banish any consciousness about the necklace, It is worth while for you to go out and look at one of the windows on that side. You can see the finest possible moonlight on the stone pillars and carving, and shadows waving across it in the wind." "I should like to see it. Will you go?" said Gwendolen, looking up at her husband. He cast his eyes down at her, and saying, "No, Deronda will take you," slowly moving from his leaning attitude, and walked away. Gwendolen's face for a moment showed a fleeting vexation. She resented this show of indifference toward her. Deronda felt annoyed, chiefly for her sake, and with a quick sense that it would relieve her most to behave as if nothing peculiar had occurred, he said, "Will you take my arm and go, while only servants are there?" He thought that he understood well her action in drawing his attention to the necklace. She wished him to infer that she had submitted her mind to rebuke. Her speech and manner had from the first fluctuated toward that submission, and that she felt no lingering resentment. Her evident confidence in his interpretation of her appealed to him as a peculiar claim. When they were walking together, Gwendolen felt as if the annoyance which had just happened had removed another film of reserve from between them, and she had more right than before to be as open as she wished. She did not speak, being filled with a sense of silent confidence, until they were in front of the window looking out on the moonlit court. A sort of bower had been made round the window, turning it into a recess. Quitting his arm, she folded her hands in her burnous and pressed her brow against the glass. He moved slightly away, and held the lapels of his coat with his thumbs under the collar, as his manner was. He had a wonderful power of standing perfectly still, and in that position reminded one sometimes of Dante's "Spiriti mani con occhi tardi e grave." Doubtless some of these danced in their youth, doubted of their own vocation, and found their own times too modern. He abstained from remarking on the scene before them, fearing that any indifferent words might jar on her. Already the calm light and shadow, the ancient steadfast forms, and aloofness enough from those inward troubles which he felt sure were agitating her. And he judged aright. She would have been impatient of polite conversation. The incidents of the last minute or two had receded behind former thoughts which she had imagined herself uttering to Deronda, which now urged themselves to her lips. In a subdued voice she said, "Suppose I had gambled again and lost the necklace, what should you have thought of me?" "Worse than I do now." "Then you are mistaken about me. You wanted me not to do that, not to make my gain out of another's loss in that way, and I have done a great deal worse." "I can't imagine temptation," said Deronda. "Perhaps I am able to understand what you mean. At least I understand self-reproach." In spite of preparation he was almost alarmed at Gwendolen's precipitancy of confidence toward him, in contrast with her habitual resolute concealment. "What should you do if you were like me, feeling that you were wrong and miserable and dreading everything to come?" It seemed that she was hurrying to make the utmost use of this opportunity to speak as she would. "That is not to be amended by doing one thing only, but many," said Deronda decisively. "What?" said Gwendolen hastily, moving her brow from the glass and looking at him. He looked full at her in return, with what she thought was severity. He felt that it was not a moment in which he must let himself be tender, and flinch from implying a hard opinion. "I mean there are many thoughts and habits that may help us to bear inevitable sorrow. Multitudes have to bear it." She turned her brow to the window again, and said impatiently, "You must tell me then what to think and what to do. Else why did you not let me go on doing as I liked and not minding? If I had gone on gambling I might have won again, and I might have got not to care for anything else. You would not let me do that. Why shouldn't I do as I like, and not mind? Other people do." Poor Gwendolen's speech expressed nothing very clearly except her irritation. "I don't believe you would ever get not to mind," said Deronda, with deep-toned decision. "If it were true that baseness and cruelty made an escape from pain, what difference would that make to people who can't be quite base or cruel? Idiots escape some pain, but you can't be an idiot. Some may do wrong to another without remorse, but suppose one does feel remorse, I believe you could never lead an injurious life. All reckless lives are injurious, pestilential, without feeling remorse." Deronda's unconscious fervor had gathered as he went on. He was uttering thoughts which he had used for himself in moments of painful meditation. "Then tell me what better I can do," said Gwendolen insistently. "Many things. Look on other lives besides your own. See what their troubles are and how they are borne. Try to care about something in this vast world besides the gratification of small selfish desires. Try to care for what is best in thought and action, something that is good apart from the accidents of your own lot." For an instant or two Gwendolen was mute. Then again, moving her brow from the glass, she said, "You mean that I am selfish and ignorant." He met her fixed look in silence before he answered firmly, "You will not go on being selfish and ignorant." She did not turn away her glance or let her eyelids fall, but a change came over her face—that subtle change in nerve and muscle which will sometimes give a childlike expression even to the elderly. It is the subsidence of self-assertion. "Shall I lead you back?" said Deronda gently, turning and offering her his arm again. She took it silently, and in that way they came in sight of Grandcourt, who was walking slowly near their former place. Gwendolen went up to him and said, "I am ready to go now. Mr. Deronda will excuse us to Lady Mallinger." "Certainly," said Deronda. "Lord and Lady Pentreath disappeared some time ago." Grandcourt gave his arm in silent compliance, nodding over his shoulder to Deronda, and Gwendolen too only half turned to bow and say, "Thanks." The husband and wife left the gallery and paced the corridors in silence. When the door had closed on them in the boudoir, Grandcourt threw himself into a chair and said with undertoned peremptoriness, "Sit down." She, already in the expectation of something unpleasant, had thrown off her burnous with nervous unconsciousness, and immediately obeyed. Turning his eyes toward her, he began, "Oblige me in future by not showing whims like a mad woman in a play." "What do you mean?" said Gwendolen. "I suppose there is some understanding between you and Deronda about that thing you have on your wrist. If you have anything to say to him, say it. But don't carry on a telegraphing which other people are supposed not to see. It's damnably vulgar." "You can know all about the necklace," said Gwendolen, her angry pride resisting the nightmare of fear. "I don't want to know. Keep to yourself whatever you like." Grandcourt paused between each sentence, and in each his speech seemed to become more preternaturally distinct in its inward tones. "What I care to know I shall know without your telling me. Only you will please to behave as becomes my wife, and not make a spectacle of yourself." "Do you object to my talking to Mr. Deronda?" "I don't care two straws about Deronda or any other conceited hanger-on. You may talk to him as much as you like. He is not going to take my place. You are my wife, and you will either fill your place properly, to the world and to me, or you will go to the devil." "I never intended anything but to fill my place properly," said Gwendolen, with bitterest mortification in her soul. "You put that thing on your wrist and hid it from me till you wanted him to see it. Only fools go into that deaf and dumb talk and think they're secret. You will understand that you are not to compromise yourself. Behave with dignity. That's all I have to say." With that last word Grandcourt rose, turned his face to the fire, and looked down on her. She was mute. There was no reproach that she dared to fling back at him in return for these insulting admonitions, and the very reason she felt them to be insulting was that their purport went with the most absolute dictate of her pride. What she would least like to incur was the making a fool of herself and being compromised. It was futile and irrelevant to try and explain that Deronda too had only been a monitor, the strongest of all monitors. Grandcourt was contemptuous, not jealous, contemptuously certain of all the subjection he cared for. Why could she not rebel and defy him? She longed to do it, but she might as well have tried to defy the texture of her nerves and the palpitation of her heart. Her husband had a ghostly army at his back that could close round her wherever she might turn. She sat in her splendid attire like a white image of helplessness, and he seemed to gratify himself with looking at her. She could not even make a passionate exclamation, or throw up her arms as she would have done in her maiden days. The sense of his scorn kept her still. "Shall I ring?" he said, after what seemed to her a long while. She moved her head in assent, and after ringing he went to his dressing-room. Certain words were gnawing within her. "The wrong you have done me will be your own curse." As he closed the door the bitter tears rose, and the gnawing words provoked an answer. "Why did you put your fangs into me and not into him?" It was uttered in a whisper, as the tears came up silently, but she immediately pressed her handkerchief against her eyes and checked her tendency to sob. The next day, recovering from the shuddering fit of this evening scene, she determined to use the charter which Grandcourt had scornfully given her, and to talk as much as she liked with Deronda. But no opportunities occurred, and any little evidence she could imagine for creating them were rejected by her pride, which was now doubly active. Not toward Deronda himself. She was singularly free from alarm lest he should think her openness wanting in dignity. It was part of his power over her that she believed in him free from all misunderstanding as to the way in which she appealed to him, or rather that he should misunderstand her had never entered into her mind. But the last morning came, and still she had never been able to take up the dropped thread of their talk, and she was without devices. She and Grandcourt were to leave at 3 o'clock. It was too irritating that after a walk in the grounds had been planned in Deronda's hearing, he did not present himself to join in it. Grandcourt was gone with Sir Hugo to King's Topping to see the old manor house. Others of the gentlemen were shooting, and she was condemned to go and see the decoy and the waterfowl and everything else that she least wanted to see, with the ladies, with old Lord Pentreath and his anecdotes, with Mr. Vandernoodt and his admiring manners. The irritation became too strong for her. Without premeditation, she took advantage of the winding road to linger a little out of sight, and then set off back to the house, almost running when she was safe from observation. She entered by a side door, and the library was on her left hand. Deronda, she knew, was often there. Why might she not turn in there as well as into any other room in the house? She had been taken there expressly to see the illuminated family tree and other remarkable things. What more natural than that she should like to look in again? The thing most to be feared was that the room would be empty of Deronda, for the door was ajar. She pushed it gently and looked round it. He was there, writing busily at a distant table with his back toward the door. In fact, Sir Hugo had asked him to answer some constituents' letters which had become pressing. An enormous log fire, with the scent of Russia from the books, made the great room as warmly odorous as a private chapel in which the censers have been swinging. It seemed too daring to go in, too rude to speak and interrupt him. Yet she went in on the noiseless carpet, and stood still for 2 or 3 minutes, till Deronda, having finished a letter, pushed it aside for signature, and threw himself back to consider whether there were anything else for him to do, or whether he could walk out for the chance of meeting the party, which included Gwendolen, when he heard her voice saying, "Mr. Deronda." It was certainly startling. He rose hastily, turned round, and pushed away his chair with a strong expression of surprise. "Am I wrong to come in?" said Gwendolen. "I thought you were far on your walk," said Deronda. "I turned back," said Gwendolen. "Do you intend to go out again? I could join you now if you would allow me." "No, I want to say something, and I can't stay long," said Gwendolen, speaking quickly in a subdued tone, while she walked forward and rested her arms and muff on the back of the chair he had pushed away from him. "I want to tell you that it is really so. I can't help feeling remorse for having injured others. That was what I meant when I said that I had done worse than gamble again and pawn the necklace again—something more injurious, as you called it. And I can't alter it. I am punished, but I can't alter it. You said I could do many things. Tell me again. What should you do? What should you feel if you were in my place?" The hurried directness with which she spoke, the absence of all her little airs, as if she were only concerned to use the time in getting an answer that would guide her, made her appeal unspeakably touching. Deronda said, "I should feel something of what you feel—deep sorrow." "But what would you try to do?" said Gwendolen, with urgent quickness. order my life so as to make any possible amends, and keep away from doing any sort of injury again," said Deronda, catching her sense that the time for speech was brief. "But I can't, I can't. I must go on," said Gwendolen in a passionate loud whisper. "I have thrust out others. I have made my gain out of their loss—tried to make it—tried. And I must go on. I can't alter it." It was impossible to answer this instantaneously. Her words had confirmed his conjecture, and the situation of all concerned rose in swift images before him. His feeling for those who had been thrust out sanctioned her remorse. He could not try to nullify it, yet his heart was full of pity for her. But as soon as he could, he answered, taking up her last words, "That is the bitterest of all, to wear the yoke of our own wrongdoing. But if you submitted to that as men submit to their maiming or lifelong incurable disease, and made the unalterable wrong a reason for more effort toward a good, that may do something to counterbalance the evil. One who has committed irremediable errors may be scourged by that consciousness into a higher course than is common. There are many examples. Feeling what it is to have spoiled one life may well make us long to save other lives from being spoiled." "But you have not wronged any one, or spoiled their lives," said Gwendolen hastily. "It is only others who have wronged you." Deronda colored slightly, but said immediately, "I suppose our keen feeling for ourselves might end in giving us a keen feeling for others, if, when we are suffering acutely, we were to consider that others go through the same sharp experience. That is a sort of remorse before commission. Can't you understand that?" "I think I do, now," said Gwendolen. "But you were right. I am selfish. I have never thought much of any one's feelings except my mother's. I have not been fond of people. But what can I do?" she went on, more quickly. "I must get up in the morning and do what every one else does. It is all like a dance set beforehand. I seem to see all that can be, and I am tired and sick of it, and the world is all confusion to me." She made a gesture of disgust. "You say I am ignorant, but what is the good of trying to know more, unless life were worth more?" "This good," said Deronda promptly, with a touch of indignant severity which he was inclined to encourage as his own safeguard, "life would be worth more to you. Some real knowledge would give you an interest in the world beyond the small drama of personal desires. It is the curse of your life—forgive me, of so many lives—that all passion is spent in that narrow round for want of ideas and sympathies to make a larger home for it. Is there any single occupation of mind that you care about with passionate delight or even independent interest?" Deronda paused, but Gwendolen, looking startled and thrilled as by an electric shock, said nothing, and he went on more insistently. "I take what you said of music for a small example. It answers for all larger things. You will not cultivate it for the sake of a private joy in it. What sort of earth or heaven would hold any spiritual wealth in it for souls pauperized by inaction? If one firmament has no stimulus for our attention and awe, I don't see how four would have it. We should stamp every possible world with the flatness of our own inanity, which is necessarily impious, without faith or fellowship. The refuge you are needing from personal trouble is the higher, the religious life, which holds an enthusiasm for something more than our own appetites and vanities. The few may find themselves in it simply by an elevation of feeling. But for us who have to struggle for our wisdom, the higher life must be a region in which the affections are clad with knowledge." The half-indignant remonstrance that vibrated in Deronda's voice came, as often happens, from the habit of inward argument with himself, rather than from severity toward Gwendolen. But it had a more beneficial effect on her than any soothings. Nothing is feebler than the indolent rebellion of complaint, and to be roused into a self-judgment is comparative activity. For the moment she felt like a shaken child, shaken out of its wailing into awe, and she said humbly, "I will try. I will think." They both stood silent for a minute, as if some third presence had arrested them. For Deronda, too, was under that sense of pressure which is apt to come when our own winged words seem to be hovering around us, till Gwendolen began again. "You said affection was the best thing, and I have hardly any—none about me. If I could, I would have mamma, but that is impossible. Things have changed to me so, in such a short time. What I used not to like I long for now. I think I am almost getting fond of the old things now they are gone." Her lip trembled. "Take the present suffering as a painful letting in of light," said Deronda, more gently. "You are conscious of more beyond the round of your own inclinations. You know more of the way in which your life presses on others, and their life on yours. I don't think you could have escaped the painful process in some form or other." "But it is a very cruel form," said Gwendolen, beating her foot on the ground with returning agitation. "I am frightened at everything. I am frightened at myself. When my blood is fired I can do daring things, take any leap, but that makes me frightened at myself." She was looking at nothing outside her, but her eyes were directed toward the window, away from Deronda, who, with quick comprehension, said, "Turn your fear into a safeguard. Keep your dread fixed on the idea of increasing that remorse which is so bitter to you. Fixed meditation may do a great deal toward defining our longing or dread. We are not always in a state of strong emotion, and when we are calm we can use our memories and gradually change the bias of our fear, as we do our tastes. Take your fear as a safeguard. It is like quickness of hearing. It may make consequences passionately present to you. Try to take hold of your sensibility and use it as if it were a faculty, like vision." Deronda uttered each sentence more urgently. He felt as if he were seizing a faint chance of rescuing her from some indefinite danger. "Yes, I know. I understand what you mean," said Gwendolen, in her loud whisper, not turning her eyes, but lifting up her small gloved hand and waving it in deprecation of the notion that it was easy to obey that advice. "But if feelings rose—there are some feelings—hatred and anger—how can I be good when they keep rising? And if there came a moment when I felt stifled and could bear it no longer—" She broke off, and with agitated lips looked at Deronda, but the expression on his face pierced her with an entirely new feeling. He was under the baffling difficulty of discerning that what he had been urging on her was thrown into the pallid distance of mere thought before the outburst of her habitual emotion. It was as if he saw her drowning while his limbs were bound. The pained compassion which was spread over his features as he watched her affected her with a compunction unlike any she had felt before, and in a changed and imploring tone she said, "I am grieving you. I am ungrateful. You can help me. I will think of everything. I will try. Tell me, it will not be a pain to you that I have dared to speak of my trouble to you? You began it, you know, when you rebuked me." There was a melancholy smile on her lips as she said that, but she added more entreatingly, "It will not be a pain to you." "Not if it does anything to save you from an evil to come," said Deronda, with strong emphasis. "Otherwise it will be a lasting pain." "No, no, it shall not be. It may be, it shall be better with me, because I have known you." She turned immediately and quitted the room. When she was on the first landing of the staircase, Sir Hugo passed across the hall on his way to the library and saw her. Grandcourt was not with him. Deronda, when the baronet entered, was standing in his ordinary attitude, grasping his coat collar, with his back to the table, and with that indefinable expression by which we judge that a man is still in the shadow of a scene which he has just gone through. He moved, however, and began to arrange the letters. "Has Mrs. Grandcourt been in here?" said Sir Hugo. "Yes, she has." "Where are the others?" "I believe she left them somewhere in the grounds." After a moment's silence, in which Sir Hugo looked at a letter without reading it, he said, "I hope you are not playing with fire, Dan. You understand me?" "I believe I do, sir," said Deronda, after a slight hesitation, which had some repressed anger in it. "But there is nothing answering to your metaphor—no fire, and therefore no chance of scorching." Sir Hugo looked searchingly at him, and then said, "So much the better. For, between ourselves, I fancy there may be some hidden gunpowder in that establishment." Chapter 37. This recording is in the public domain.